Section 41 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 15. How Blueskin Underwent the Peine Forte et Dure. As soon as it became known, through the medium of the public prints on the following day, that Jack Sheppard had broken out of prison and had been again captured during the night, fresh curiosity was excited, and larger crowds than ever flocked to Newgate, in the hope of obtaining admission to his cell. But by the governor's express commands, Wilde having privately counselled the step, no one was allowed to see him. The question next arose whether the prisoner could be executed under the existing warrant, some inclining to one opinion, some to another. To settle the point, the governor started to Windsor, delegating his trust in the interim to Wilde, who took advantage of his brief rule to adopt the harshest measures towards the prisoner. He had him removed from the condemned hold, stripped of his fine apparel, clothed in the most sordid rags, loaded with additional fetters, and thrust into the stone hold, already described as the most noisome cell in the whole prison. Here, without a glimpse of daylight, visited by no one except Austin at stated intervals, who neither answered a question nor addressed a word to him, fed upon the worst diet, literally mouldy bread and ditch water, surrounded by stone walls, with a flagged floor for his pillow, and without so much as a blanket to protect him from the death-like cold that pierced his frame. Jack's stout heart was subdued, and he fell into the deepest dejection, ardently longing for the time when even a violent death should terminate his sufferings. But it was not so ordered. Mr. Pitt returned with intelligence that the warrant was delayed, and on taking the opinion of two eminent lawyers of the day, Sir William Thompson and Mr. Sergeant Raby, it was decided that it must be proved in a regular and judicial manner that Sheppard was the identical person who had been convicted and had escaped, before a fresh order could be made for his execution, and that the matter must therefore stand over until the next sessions, to be held at the Old Bailey in October, when it could be brought before the court. The unfortunate prisoner, meanwhile, who was not informed of the respite, languished in his horrible dungeon, and at the expiration of 3 weeks became so seriously indisposed that it was feared he could not long survive. He refused his food, and even when better provisions were offered him, rejected them. As his death was by no means what Jonathan desired, he resolved to remove him to a more airy ward, and afford him such slight comforts as might tend to his restoration, or at least keep him alive until the period of execution. With this view, Jack was carried, for he was no longer able to move without assistance, to a ward called the Castle, situated over the gateway on the western side, in what was considered the strongest part of the jail. The walls were of immense thickness, the small windows double-grated and unglazed. The fireplace was without a grate, and a barrack bed divided into 2 compartments occupied one corner. It was about 12 feet high, 9 wide, and 14 long, and was approached by double doors each 6 inches thick. As Jack appeared to be sinking fast, his fetters were removed, his own clothes were returned to him, and he was allowed a mattress and a scanty supply of bed linen. Mrs. Spurling attended him as his nurse, and under her care he speedily revived. As soon as he became convalescent, and all fears of his premature dissolution were at an end, Wilde recommenced his rigorous treatment. The bedding was removed. Mrs. Spurling was no longer allowed to visit him. He was again loaded with irons, fastened by an enormous horse padlock to a staple in the floor, and only allowed to take repose in a chair. A single blanket constituted his sole covering at night. In spite of all this, he grew daily better and stronger, and his spirits revived. Hitherto, no visitors had been permitted to see him. As the time when his identity had to be proved approached, this rigor was, in a trifling degree, relaxed, and a few persons were occasionally admitted to the ward, but only in the presence of Austen. From none of these could Jack ascertain what had become of Thames, or learn any particulars concerning the family at Dollis Hill, or of his mother. Austen, who had been evidently schooled by Wilde, maintained a profound silence on this head. In this way, more than a month passed over October arrived, and in another week the court would be sitting at the Old Bailey. One night, about this time, just as Austen was about to lock the great gate, Jonathan Wilde and his 2 Janissaries entered the lodge with a prisoner bound hand and foot. It was Blueskin. On the cords being removed, he made a desperate spring at Wilde, bore him to the ground, clutched at his throat, and would infallibly have strangled him if the keepers had not all thrown themselves upon him and by main force torn him off. His struggles were so violent that, being a man of tremendous strength, it was some time before they could master him, and it required the combined efforts of all the 4 partners to put him into irons. It appeared from what he said that he had been captured when asleep, that his liquor had been drugged. Otherwise, he would never have allowed himself to be taken alive. Wilde, he asserted, had robbed him of a large sum of money, and till it was restored he would never plead. "We'll see that," replied Jonathan. "Take him to the bilboes. Put him in the stocks, and there let him sleep off his drunken fit. Whether he pleads or not, he shall swing with his confederate, Jack Sheppard." At this allusion to his leader, a shudder passed through Blueskin's athletic frame. "Where is he?" he cried. "Let me see him. Let me have a word with him, and you may take all the money." Jonathan made no answer, but motioned the partners to take him away. As soon as Blueskin was removed, Wilde intimated his intention of visiting the castle. He was accompanied by Ireton and Austen. The massive door was unlocked, and they entered the cell. What was their surprise to find it vacant, and the prisoner gone! Jonathan could scarcely believe his eyes. He looked fiercely and inquiringly from one to the other of his companions, but though both of them were excessively frightened, neither appeared guilty. Before a word could be said, however, a slight noise was heard in the chimney, and Jack, with his irons on, descended from it. Without betraying the slightest confusion or making a single remark, he quietly resumed his seat. "Amazement!" cried Wilde. "How has he unfastened his padlock? Austen, it must be owing to your negligence." "My negligence, Mr. Wilde?" said the turnkey, trembling in every joint. "I assure you, sir, when I left him an hour ago, it was locked. I tried it myself, sir. I'm as much astonished as you, but I can't account for it." "At all events, you shall answer for it," thundered Wilde, with a bitter imprecation. "He's not to blame," said Jack, rising. "I opened the padlock with this crooked nail which I found in the floor. If you had arrived 10 minutes later, or if there hadn't been an iron bar in the chimney that hindered my progress, I should have been beyond your reach." "You talk boldly," replied Wilde. "Go to the iron hold, Austen, and tell 2 of the partners to bring another padlock of the largest size and the heaviest handcuffs they can find. We'll try whether he'll get loose again." Sheppard said nothing, but a disdainful smile curled his lips. Austen departed, and presently afterwards returned with the 2 subordinate officers, each of whom wore a leathern apron round his waist and carried a large hammer. As soon as the manacles were slipped over the prisoner's wrists and the new padlock secured to the staple, they withdrew. "Leave me alone with him a moment," said Jonathan, and the jailers also retired. "Jack," said Wilde, with a glance of malignant triumph, "I will now tell you what I have done. All my plans have succeeded. Before a month has elapsed, your mother will be mine. The Trenchard estates will likewise be mine, for Sir Rowland is no more, and the youth, Thames, will never again see daylight. Blueskin, who had evaded me with the papers and the money, is a prisoner here, and will perish on the same gallows as yourself. My vengeance is completely gratified." Without waiting for a reply, but darting a malevolent look at the prisoner, he quitted the cell, the door of which was instantly double-locked and bolted. "I've not quite done yet," said Jonathan, as he joined the turnkeys. "I should like to see whether Blueskin is a little more composed. I've a question to ask him. Give me the keys and the light. I'll go alone." So saying, he descended a short spiral staircase, and entering a long stone gallery from which several other passages branched, took one of them, and after various turnings, for he was familiar with all the intricacies of the prison, arrived at the cell of which he was in search. Selecting a key from the heavy bunch committed to him by Austen, he threw open the door, and beheld Blueskin seated at the back of the small chamber, handcuffed, and with his feet confined in a heavy pair of stocks. He was asleep when Jonathan entered, and growled at being disturbed. But as soon as he perceived who it was, he roused himself, and glared fiercely at the intruder from under his bent brows. "What do you want?" he asked, in a gruff voice. "I want to know what you've done with the rest of the notes, with the gold, and the papers you took away from my room," rejoined Wilde. "Then you'll never know more than this," retorted Blueskin, with a grin of satisfaction. "They're in a place of safety where you'll never find 'em, but where somebody else will, and that before long." "Hear me, Blueskin," said Jonathan, restraining his collar. "If you'll tell me where to look for these things, and I do find them, I'll set you free, and you shall have a share of the gold for yourself." "I'll tell you what I'll do," rejoined the other. "Set Captain Sheppard free, and when I hear he's safe, not before, I'll put the money and papers into your possession, and some other matters too that you know nothing about." "Impracticable dolt!" exclaimed Jonathan, furiously. "Do you think I'd part with the sweetest morsel of revenge on those terms? No, but I'll have the secret out of you by other means." So saying, he violently shut and locked the door. About 10 days after this interview, Blueskin, having been indicted by Wilde for several robberies, and true bills found against him, was placed at the bar of the Old Bailey to be arraigned, when he declared that he would not plead to the indictment unless the sum of £500 taken from him by Jonathan Wilde was first restored to him. This sum, claimed by Wilde under the statute 4th and 5th of William and Mary, entitled "An Act for Encouraging the Apprehending of Highwaymen," was granted to him by the court. As Blueskin still continued obstinate, the judgment appointed to be executed upon such prisoners as stood mute was then read. It was as follows, and when uttered produced a strong effect upon all who heard it, except the prisoner, who in no respect altered his sullen and dogged demeanor. "Prisoner at the bar," thus ran the sentence, "you shall be taken to the prison from whence you came, and put into a mean room, stopped from the light, and shall there be laid on the bare ground without any litter, straw, or other covering, and without any garment. You shall lie upon your back, your head shall be covered, and your feet shall be bare. One of your arms shall be drawn to one side of the room, and the other arm to the other side, and your legs shall be served in the like manner. Then there shall be laid upon your body as much iron or stone as you can bear, and more. And the first day you shall have 3 morsels of barley bread without any drink, and the second day you shall be allowed to drink as much as you can at 3 times of the water that is next to the prison door, except running water, without any bread. And this shall be your diet till you die. Prisoner at the bar," continued the clerk of the court, "he against whom this judgment is given forfeits his goods to the king." An awful silence prevailed throughout the court. Every eye was fixed upon the prisoner, but as he made no answer, he was removed. Before the full sentence was carried into execution, he was taken into a small room adjoining the court. Here Marvel, the executioner, who was in attendance, was commanded by Wilde to tie his thumbs together, which he did with whipcord so tightly that the string cut to the bone. But as this produced no effect, and did not even elicit a groan, the prisoner was carried back to Newgate. The press room to which Blueskin was conveyed on his arrival at the jail was a small, square chamber, walled and paved with stone. In each corner stood a stout, square post reaching to the ceiling. To these a heavy wooden apparatus was attached, which could be raised or lowered at pleasure by pulleys. In the floor were set 4 ring bolts about 9 feet apart. When the prisoner was brought into this room, he was again questioned, but continuing contumacious, preparations were made for inflicting the torture. His great personal strength being so well known, it was deemed prudent by Marvell to have all the 4 partners, together with Caliban, in attendance. The prisoner, however, submitted more quietly than was anticipated. He allowed his irons and clothes to be taken off without resistance. But just as they were about to place him on the ground, he burst from their hold and made a desperate spring at Jonathan, who was standing with his arms folded near the door, watching the scene. The attempt was unsuccessful. He was instantly overpowered and stretched upon the ground. The 4 men fell upon him, holding his arms and legs, while Caliban forced back his head. In this state, he contrived to get the poor black's hand into his mouth and nearly bit off one of his fingers before the sufferer could be rescued. Meanwhile, the executioner had attached strong cords to his ankles and wrists and fastened them tightly to the iron rings. This done, he unloosed the pulley, and the ponderous machine, which resembled a trough, slowly descended upon the prisoner's breast. Marvell then took 2 iron weights, each of 100 pounds, and placed them in the press. As this seemed insufficient, after a lapse of 5 minutes he added another 100-weight. The prisoner breathed with difficulty. Still, his robust frame enabled him to hold out. After he had endured this torture for an hour, at a sign from Wilde another 100-weight was added. In a few minutes an appalling change was perceptible. The veins in his throat and forehead swelled and blackened. His eyes protruded from their sockets and stared wildly. A thick damp gathered on his brow, and blood gushed from his mouth, nostrils, and ears. "Water!" he gasped. The executioner shook his head. "Do you submit?" interrogated Wilde. Blueskin answered by dashing his head violently against the flagged floor. His efforts at self-destruction were, however, prevented. "Try 50 pounds more," said Jonathan. "Stop!" groaned Blueskin. "Will you plead?" demanded Wilde, harshly. "I will," answered the prisoner. "Release him," said Jonathan. "We have cured his obstinacy, you perceive," he added to Marvell. "I will live," cried Blueskin, with a look of the deadliest hatred at Wilde, "to be revenged on you." And as the weights were removed, he fainted. This ends chapter 15, How Blueskin Underwent the Peine Forte et Dure. Section 42 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 16. How Jack Sheppard's Portrait Was Painted. Early in the morning of Thursday, the 15th of October, 1724, the door of the castle was opened by Austin, who, with a look of unusual importance, announced to the prisoner that 4 gentlemen were shortly coming up with the governor to see him. 4 such gentlemen, he added, in a tone meant to impress his auditor with a due sense of the honor intended him, as you don't meet every day. "Is Mr. Wood among them?" asked Jack eagerly. "Mr. Wood? No," replied the turnkey. "Do you think I take the trouble to announce him? These are persons of consequence, I tell you." "Who are they?" inquired Sheppard. "Why, first," rejoined Austen, "there's Sir James Thornhill, historical painter to his Majesty, and the greatest artist of the day. Those grand designs in the dome of St. Peter's are his work. So is the roof of the stateroom at Hampton Court Palace, occupied by Queen Anne and the Prince of Denmark. So is the chapel of All Souls at Oxford, and the great hall at Blenheim, and I don't know how many halls and chapels besides. He's now engaged on the hall at Greenwich Hospital." "I've heard of him," replied Jack impatiently. "Who are the others?" "Let me see. There's a friend of Sir James, a young man, an engraver of masquerade tickets and caricatures. His name, I believe, is Hogarth. Then there's Mr. Gay, the poet, who wrote The Captives, which was lately acted at Drury Lane, and was so much admired by the Princess of Wales. And lastly, there's Mr. Figg, the noted prize-fighter, from the new amphitheatre in Marylebone Fields." "Figg's an old friend of mine," rejoined Jack. "He was my instructor in the small sword and back sword exercise. I'm glad he's come to see me." "You don't inquire what brings Sir James Thornhill here?" said Austen. "Curiosity, I suppose," returned Jack carelessly. "No such thing," rejoined the jailer. "He's coming on business." "On what business, in the name of wonder?" asked Sheppard. "To paint your portrait," answered the jailer. "My portrait?" echoed Jack. "By desire of his Majesty," said the jailer consequentially. "He's heard of your wonderful escapes and wishes to see what you're like. There's a feather in your cap. No housebreaker was ever so highly honored before." "And have my escapes really made so much noise as to reach the ear of royalty?" mused Jack. "I have done nothing. Nothing to what I could do, to what I will do." "You've done quite enough," rejoined Austen, "more than you'll ever do again." "And then to be taken thus in these disgraceful bonds," continued Jack, "to be held up as a sight forever." "Why, how else would you be taken?" exclaimed the jailer, with a coarse laugh. "It's very well Mr. Wilde allowed you to have your fine clothes again, or you might have been taken in a still more disgraceful garb. For my part, I think those shackles extremely becoming. But here they are." Voices being heard at the door, Austen flew to open it, and admitted Mr. Pitt, the governor, a tall, pompous personage who, in his turn, ushered in 4 other individuals. The first of these, whom he addressed as Mr. Gay, was a stout, good-looking, good-humoured man about 36, with a dark complexion, an oval face, fine black eyes, full of fire and sensibility, and twinkling with roguish humour, an expression fully borne out by the mouth, which had a very shrewd and sarcastic curl. The poet's appearance altogether was highly prepossessing. With a strong tendency to satire, but without a particle of malice or ill nature in its display, Gay, by his strokes of pleasantry, whether in his writings or conversation, never lost a friend. On the contrary, he was a universal favourite, and numbered amongst his intimate acquaintances the choicest spirits of the time, Pope, Swift, Arbuthnot, and all the better brothers. His demeanour was polished, his manners singularly affable and gentle. He was remarkable for the generosity of his temper. In worldly matters Gay was not fortunate. Possessed at one time of a share in the South Sea stock, he conceived himself worth £20,000. But on the bursting of that bubble, his hopes vanished with it. Neither did his interest, which was by no means inconsiderable, nor his general popularity, procure him the preferment he desired. A constant attendant at court, he had the mortification to see every one promoted but himself, and thus bewails his ill luck. Places, I found, were daily given away, and yet no friendly gazette mentioned Gay. The prodigious success of The Beggar's Opera, which was produced about 4 years after the date of this history, rewarded him for all his previous disappointments, though it did not fully justify the well-known epigram alluding to himself and the manager, and "make Gay rich, and rich Gay." At the time of his present introduction, his play of The Captives had just been produced at Drury Lane, and he was meditating his fables, which were published 2 years afterwards. Behind the poet came Sir James Thornhill. The eminent painter had handsome, expressive features, an aquiline nose, and a good deal of dignity in his manner. His age was not far from 50. He was accompanied by a young man of about 27, who carried his easel, set it in its place, laid the canvas upon it, opened the paint-box, took out the brushes and palette, and, in short, paid him the most assiduous attention. This young man, whose features, though rather plain and coarse, bore the strongest impress of genius, and who had a dark grey penetrating eye, so quick in its glances that it seemed to survey 20 objects at once, and yet only to fasten upon one, bore the honoured name of William Hogarth. Why he paid so much attention to Sir James Thornhill may be explained anon. The rear of the party was brought up by a large, powerfully built man, with a bluff, honest, but rugged countenance, slashed with many a cut and scar, and stamped with that surly, sturdy, bulldog-like look which an Englishman always delights to contemplate, because he conceives it to be characteristic of his countrymen. This formidable person, who was no other than the renowned Fig, the Atlas of the Sword, as he is termed by Captain Godfrey, had removed his hat and skull covering, and was wiping the heat from his bepatched and close-shaven pate. His shirt also was unbuttoned, and disclosed a neck like that of an ox, and a chest which might have served as a model for a Hercules. He had a flattish, perhaps it should be called a flattened, nose, and a brown, leathern-looking hide that seemed as if it had not unfrequently undergone the process of tanning. Under his arm he carried a thick, knotted crab-stick. The above description of the great Fig by prize-fighting swains, sole monarch acknowledged of Marybone Plains, may sound somewhat tame by the side of the glowing account given of him by his gallant biographer, who asserts that there was a majesty shown in his countenance and blazed in his actions beyond all I ever saw. But it may possibly convey a more accurate notion of his personal appearance. James Fig was the most perfect master of self-defense of his day. Seconded by his strength and temper, his skill rendered him invincible, and he is reputed never to have lost a battle. His imperturbable demeanour in the fight has been well portrayed by Captain Godfrey, who here condescends to lay aside his stilts. His right leg bold and firm, and his left, which could hardly ever be disturbed, gave him a surprising advantage, and struck his adversary with despair and panic. He had a peculiar way of stepping in a parry, knew his arm, and its just time of moving, put a firm faith in that, and never let his opponent escape. He was just as much a greater master than any other I ever saw, and he was a greater judge of time and measure. Fig's prowess in a combat with Button has been celebrated by Dr. Byrom, a poet of whom his native town, Manchester, may be justly proud, and his features and figure have been preserved by the most illustrious of his companions on the present occasion, Hogarth, in the levee in the Rake's Progress, and in Southwark Fair. On the appearance of his visitors, Sheppard arose, his gyves clanking heavily as he made the movement, and folding his arms, so far as his manacles would permit him, upon his breast, steadily returned the glances fixed upon him. "This is the noted housebreaker and prison-breaker, gentlemen," said Mr. Pitt, pointing to the prisoner.
"Odds life!" cried Gay in astonishment. "Is this slight-made stripling Jack Sheppard? Why, I expected to see a man 6 foot high at the least, and as broad across the shoulders as our friend Fig. This is a mere boy. Are you sure you haven't mistaken the ward, Mr. Pitt?"
"There is no mistake, sir," rejoined the prisoner, drawing himself up. "I am Jack Sheppard."
"Well, I never was more surprised in my life," said the poet. "Never." "He's just the man I expected to see," observed Hogarth.
who, having arranged everything to Thornhill's satisfaction, had turned to look at the prisoner, and was now with his chin upon his wrist and his elbow supported by the other hand, bending his keen grey eyes upon him.
"Just the man. Look at that light, lithe figure, all muscle and activity, with not an ounce of superfluous flesh upon it. In my search after strange characters, Mr. Gay, I've been in many odd quarters of our city, have visited haunts frequented only by thieves, the Old Mint, the New Mint, the worst part of St. Giles, and other places, but I've nowhere seen anyone who came up so completely to my notion of a first-rate housebreaker as the individual before us. Wherever I saw him, I should pick him out as a man designed by nature to plan and accomplish the wonderful escapes he has effected."
As he spoke, a smile crossed Sheppard's countenance.
"He understands me, you perceive," said Hogarth.
"Well, I won't dispute your judgment in such matters, Mr. Hogarth," replied Gay, "but I appeal to you, Sir James, whether it isn't extraordinary that so very slight a person should be such a desperate robber as he is represented. So young, too, for such an old offender. Why, he can scarcely be 20.
"I'm 21, observed Jack. 21, ah," repeated Gay. "Well, I'm not far from the mark."
"He's certainly extremely youthful-looking and very slightly made," said Thornhill, who had been attentively studying Sheppard's countenance. "But I agree with Hogarth that he is precisely the person to do what he has done. Like a thoroughbred racer, he would sustain twice as much fatigue as a person of heavier mould. Can I be accommodated with a seat, Mr. Pitt?" "Certainly, Sir James, certainly," replied the governor. "Get a chair, Austin." While this order was obeyed, Fig, who had been standing near the door, made his way to the prisoner, and offered him his huge hand, which Jack warmly grasped.
"Well, Jack,"
said the prize fighter, in a rough but friendly voice, and with a cut-and-thrust abrupt manner peculiar to himself.
"How are you, lad, eh? Sorry to see you here. Wouldn't take my advice. Told you how it would be. One mistress enough to ruin a man, too, the devil. Laughed at me then. Laugh on the wrong side of your mouth now."
"You're not come here to insult me, Mr. Fig," said Jack peevishly.
"Insult you? Not I," returned Fig. "Heard of your escapes. Everybody talking of you. Wish to see you. Old pupil. Capital swordsman. Shortly to be executed. Come to take leave. Trifle useful," he added, slipping a few gold pieces into Jack's hand.
"You're very kind," said Jack, returning the money, "but I don't require assistance."
"Too proud, eh?"
rejoined the prize fighter. "Won't be under an obligation." "There you're wrong, Mr. Fig," replied Jack, smiling, "for before I'm taken to Tyburn, I mean to borrow a shirt for the occasion from you."
"Have it, and welcome," rejoined Fig. "Always plenty to spare. Never bought a shirt in my life, Mr. Gay," he added, turning to the poet. "Sold a good many, though."
"How do you manage that, Mr. Fig?" asked Gay.
"Thus," replied the prize fighter. "Proclaim a public fight. Challenge accepted. 50 pupils. Day before, send round to each to borrow a shirt. 50 sent home. All superfine Holland. Wear one on the stage on the following day. Cut to pieces, slashed, bloodied. Each of my scholars thinks it is his own shirt. Offer to return it to each in private. All make the same answer. Damn you, keep it."
"An ingenious device," laughed Gay.
Sir James Thornhill's preparations being completed, Mr. Pitt desired to know if he wanted anything further, and being answered in the negative, he excused himself on the plea that his attendance was required in the court at the Old Bailey, which was then sitting, and withdrew. "Do me the favour and seat yourself, Jack," said Sir James. "Gentlemen, a little further off, if you please." Sheppard immediately complied with the painter's request, while Gay and Fig drew back on one side and Hogarth on the other. The latter took from his pocket a small notebook and pencil.
"I'll make a sketch too," he said. "Jack Sheppard's face is well worth preserving."
After narrowly examining the countenance of the sitter and motioning him with his pencil into a peculiar attitude, Sir James Thornhill commenced operations, and while he rapidly transferred his lineaments to the canvas, engaged him in conversation, in the course of which he artfully contrived to draw him into a recital of his adventures. The ruse succeeded almost beyond his expectation. During the narration, Jack's features lighted up, and an expression which would have been in vain looked for in repose was instantly caught and depicted by the skilful artist. All the party were greatly interested by Sheppard's history, especially Fig, who laughed loud and long at the escape from the condemned hold. When Jack came to speak of Jonathan Wild, his countenance fell. "We must change the subject," remarked Thornhill, pausing in his task. "This will never do." "Quite right, Mr. James," said Austen. "We never suffer him to mention Mr. Wilde's name. He never appears to so little advantage as when speaking of him."
"I don't wonder at it," rejoined Gay.
Here Hogarth received a private signal from Thornhill to attract Sheppard's attention.
"And so you've given up all hope of escaping, Jack?" remarked Hogarth.
"That's scarcely a fair question, Mr. Hogarth, before the jailer," replied Jack. "But I tell you frankly, and Mr. Austen may repeat it if he pleases to his master, Jonathan Wild, I have not."
"Well said, Jack," cried Fig. "Never give in."
"Well," observed Hogarth, "if, fettered as you are, you contrive to break out of this dungeon, you'll do what no man ever did before." A peculiar smile illuminated Jack's features. "There it is," cried Sir James eagerly. "There's the exact expression I want. For the love of heaven, Jack, don't move. Don't alter a muscle if you can help it." And with a few magical touches, he stamped the fleeting expression on the canvas.
"I have it too," exclaimed Hogarth,
busily plying his pencil. "Gad, it's a devilish fine face when lit up." "As like as life, sir," observed Austen, peeping over Thornhill's shoulder at the portrait. "As like as life."
"The very face," exclaimed Gay, advancing to look at it, "with all the escapes written in it."
"You flatter me," smiled Sir James, "but I own I think it is like."
"What do you think of my sketch, Jack?"
said Hogarth, handing him the drawing.
"It's like enough, I dare say," rejoined Sheppard, "but it wants something here," and he pointed significantly to the hand.
"I see," rejoined Hogarth, rapidly sketching a file, which he placed in the hands of the picture. "Will that do?" he added, returning it. "It's better," observed Sheppard, meaningly, "but you've given me what I don't possess."
Said Hogarth, looking fixedly at him. "I don't see how I can improve it."
"May I look at it, sir?" said Austen, stepping towards him.
"No," replied Hogarth, hastily effacing the sketch. "I'm never satisfied with the first attempt." "Egad, Jack," said Gay, "you should write your adventures. They would be quite as entertaining as the histories of Guzman d'Alferrach, Lazarillo de Tormes, Estevanillo Gonzalez, Meriton Latrun, or any of my favorite rogues, and far more instructive."
"You'd better write them for me, Mr. Gay," rejoined Jack.
"If you'll write them, I'll illustrate them," observed Hogarth. "An idea has just occurred to me," said Gay, "which Jack's narrative has suggested. I'll write an opera, the scene of which shall be laid altogether in Newgate, and the principal character shall be a highwayman. I'll not forget your two mistresses, Jack."
"Nor Jonathan Wild, I hope," interposed Sheppard.
"Certainly not," replied Gay. "I'll gibbet the rascal. But I forget," he added, glancing at Austen. "It's high treason to speak disrespectfully of Mr. Wilde in his own domain." I heard nothing, sir, laughed Austen. I was about to add, continued Gay, that my opera shall have no music except the good old ballad tunes, and we'll see whether it won't put the Italian opera out of fashion, with Cuzzoni, Senesino, and with divine Farinelli at its head. You'll do a natural service then, said Hogarth. The sums lavished upon those people are perfectly disgraceful, and I should be enchanted to see them hooted from the stage. But I've an idea as well as you, grounded in some measure upon Sheppard's story. I'll take 2 apprentices and depict their career. One, by perseverance and industry, shall obtain fortune, credit, and the highest honours, while the other, by an opposite course and dissolute habits, shall eventually arrive at Tyburn. Yours will be nearer the truth and have a deeper moral, Mr. Hogarth, remarked Jack dejectedly. But if my career were truly exhibited, it must be as one long struggle against destiny in the shape of— Jonathan Wild, interposed Gay. I knew it. By the by, Mr. Hogarth, didn't I see you last night at the Ridotto with Lady Thornhill and her pretty daughter? Me? No, sir, stammered Hogarth, colouring, and he hazarded a wink at the poet over the paper on which he was sketching. Luckily, Sir James was so much engrossed by his own task that both the remark and gesture escaped him. I suppose I was mistaken, returned Gay. You've been quizzing my friend Kent, I perceive, in your Burlington gait. A capital caricature, that, remarked Thornhill, laughing. What does Mr. Kent say to it? He thinks so highly of it that he says if he had a daughter, he'd give her to the artist, answered Gay a little maliciously. Ah, exclaimed Sir James. Steph, cried Hogarth, aside to the poet, you've ruined my hopes. Advanced them rather, replied Gay in the same tone. Miss Thornhill's a charming girl. I think a wife a needless encumbrance, and mean to die a bachelor. But if I were in your place, I know what I'd do. What? What would you do? Asked Hogarth, eagerly. Run away with her, replied Gay. Pish! Exclaimed Hogarth. But he afterwards acted upon the suggestion. Goodbye, Jack, said Fig, putting on his hat. Rather in the way. Send you the shirt. Here, turnkey, couple of guineas to drink Captain Sheppard's speedy escape. Thank him, not me, man. Give this fellow the slip if you can, Jack. If not, keep up your spirits. Die game. Never fear, replied Jack. If I get free, I'll have a bout with you at all weapons. If not, I'll take a cheerful glass with you at the city of Oxford on my way to Tyburn. Give you the best I have in either case, replied Fig. Goodbye. And with a cordial shake of the hand, he took his departure. Sir James Thornhill then rose. I won't trouble you further, Jack, he remarked. I've done all I can to the portrait here. I must finish it at home. Permit me to see it, Sir James, requested Jack. Ah, he exclaimed, as the painting was turned towards him. What would my poor mother say to it? I was sorry to hear about your mother, Jack, observed Hogarth. What of her? Exclaimed Jack, starting up. Is she dead? No, answered Hogarth. Don't alarm yourself. I saw it this morning in the Daily Journal. An advertisement offering a reward. A reward, echoed Jack. For what? I had the paper with me. Steph, what can I have done with it? Oh, here it is, cried Hogarth, picking it from the ground. I must have dropped it when I took out my notebook. There's the paragraph. Mrs. Sheppard left Mr. Wood's house at Dollis Hill on Tuesday. That's 2 days ago. Hasn't been heard of since. Let me see, cried Jack, snatching the paper and eagerly perusing the advertisement. Ah, he exclaimed in a tone of anguish, she's fallen into the villain's hands. What villain? Cried Hogarth. Jonathan Wild, I'll be sworn, said Gay. Right, cried Jack, striking his fettered hands against his breast.
She is in his power, and I am here, chained hand and foot, unable to assist her."
"I could have made a fine sketch of him now," whispered Hogarth to Gay.
"I told you how it was, Sir James," said Austen, addressing the knight, who was preparing for his departure. "He attributes every misfortune that befalls him to Mr. Wilde."
"And with some justice," replied Thornhill, dryly. "Allow me to assist you, Sir James," said Hogarth.
"Many thanks, sir," replied Thornhill with freezing politeness, "but I'd not require assistance."
"I tell you what, Jack," said Gay, "I've several urgent engagements this morning, but I'll return tomorrow and hear the rest of your story, and if I can render you any assistance, you may command me."
"Tomorrow will be too late," said Sheppard, moodily. The easel and palette having been packed up, and the canvas carefully removed by Austen, the party took leave of the prisoner, who was so much abstracted that he scarcely noticed their departure. Just as Hogarth got to the door, the turnkey stopped him.
"You've forgotten your knife, Mr. Hogarth," he observed significantly.
"So I have," replied Hogarth, glancing at Sheppard.
"I can do without it," muttered Jack.
The door was then locked, and he was left alone. At 3 o'clock on the same day, Austen brought up Jack's provisions, and after carefully examining his fetters and finding all secure, told him if he wanted anything further he must mention it, as he should not be able to return in the evening, his presence being required elsewhere. Jack replied in the negative, and it required all his mastery over himself to prevent the satisfaction which this announcement afforded him from being noticed by the jailer. With the usual precautions, Austen then departed.
"And now," cried Jack, leaping up, "for an achievement compared with which all I have yet done shall be as nothing."
This ends chapter 16, How Jack Sheppard's Portrait was Painted. Section 43 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 17, The Iron Bar. Jack Sheppard's first object was to free himself from his handcuffs. This he accomplished by holding the chain that connected them firmly between his teeth and squeezing his fingers as closely together as possible, succeeded in drawing his wrists through the manacles. He next twisted the heavy jibes round and round, and partly by main strength, partly by a dexterous and well-applied jerk, sapped asunder the central link by which they were attached to the padlock. Taking off his stockings, he then drew up the basils as far as he was able, and tied the fragments of the broken chain to his legs, to prevent them from clanking and impeding his future exertions. Jack's former attempt to pass up the chimney, it may be remembered, was obstructed by an iron bar. To remove this obstacle, it was necessary to make an extensive breach in the wall. With the broken links of the chain, which served him in lieu of more efficient implements, he commenced operations just above the chimney-piece, and soon contrived to pick a hole in the plaster. He found the wall, as he suspected, solidly constructed of brick and stone, and with the slight and inadequate tools which he possessed, it was a work of infinite labor and skill to get out a single brick. That done, however, he was well aware the rest would be comparatively easy, and as he threw the brick to the ground, he exclaimed triumphantly, "The first step is taken. The main difficulty is overcome." Animated by this trifling success, he proceeded with fresh ardor, and the rapidity of his progress was proclaimed by the heap of bricks, stones, and mortar which before long covered the floor. At the expiration of an hour, by dint of unremitting exertion, he'd made so large a breach in the chimney that he could stand upright in it. He was now within a foot of the bar, and introducing himself into the hole, speedily worked his way to it. Regardless of the risk he incurred from some heavy stone dropping on his head or feet, regardless also of the noise made by the falling rubbish and of the imminent danger which he consequently ran of being interrupted by some of the jailers should the sound reach their ears, he continued to pull down large masses of the wall, which he flung upon the floor of the cell. Having worked thus for another quarter of an hour without being sensible of fatigue, though he was half stifled by the clouds of dust which his exertions raised, he had made a hole about 3 feet wide and 6 high, and uncovered the iron bar. Grasping it firmly with both hands, he quickly wrenched it from the stones in which it was mortised, and leapt to the ground. On examination it proved to be a flat bar of iron, nearly a yard in length and more than an inch square. A capital instrument for my purpose, thought Jack, shouldering it, and worth all the trouble I have had in procuring it. While he was thus musing, he fancied he heard the lock tried. A chill ran through his frame, and grasping the heavy weapon with which chance had provided him, prepared to strike down the first person who should enter the cell. After listening attentively for a short time without drawing breath, he became convinced that his apprehensions were groundless, and greatly relieved, sat down upon the chair to rest himself and prepare for further efforts. Acquainted with every part of the jail, Jack well knew that his only chance of effecting an escape must be by the roof. To reach it would be a most difficult undertaking. Still, it was possible, and the difficulty was only a fresh incitement. The mere enumeration of the obstacles that existed would have deterred any spirit less daring than Sheppard's from even hazarding the attempt. Independently of other risks and of the chance of breaking his neck in the descent, he was aware that to reach the leads he should have to break open 6 of the strongest doors of the prison. Armed, however, with the implement he had so fortunately obtained, he did not despair of success. "My name will only be remembered as that of a robber," he mused, "but it shall be remembered as that of a bold one, and this night's achievement, if it does nothing else, shall prevent me from being classed with the common herd of depredators." Roused by this reflection, filled with the deepest anxiety for his mother, and burning to be avenged upon Jonathan Wild, he grasped the iron bar which, when he sat down, he had laid upon his knees, and stepped quickly across the room. In doing so, he had to clamber up the immense heap of bricks and rubbish which now littered the floor, amounting almost to a carload, and reaching up nearly to the top of the chimney-piece. "Austin will stare," thought Jack, "when he comes here in the morning. It will cost them something to repair their stronghold, and take them more time to build it up again than I have taken to pull it down." Before proceeding with this task, he considered whether it would be possible to barricade the door. But, reflecting that the bar would be an indispensable assistant in his further efforts, he abandoned the idea, and determined to rely implicitly on that good fortune which had hitherto attended him on similar occasions. Having once more got into the chimney, he climbed to a level with the ward above, and recommenced operations as vigorously as before. He was now aided with a powerful implement with which he soon contrived to make a hole in the wall. "Every brick I take out," cried Jack, as fresh rubbish clattered down the chimney, "brings me nearer my mother." This ends Chapter 17, The Iron Bar. Section 44 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 18. The Red Room. The ward into which Jack was endeavoring to break was called the Red Room, from the circumstance of its walls having once been painted in that color, all traces of which had, however, long since disappeared. Like the castle, which it resembled in all respects except that it was destitute even of a barrack bedstead, The Red Room was reserved for state prisoners and had not been occupied since the year 1716, when the jail, as has before been mentioned, was crowded by the Preston rebels. Having made a hole in the wall sufficiently large to pass through, Jack first tossed the bar into the room and then crept after it. As soon as he had gained his feet, he glanced round the bare blank walls of the cell, and, oppressed by the musty, close atmosphere, exclaimed, "I'll let a little fresh air into this dungeon. They say it hasn't been opened for 8 years, but I won't be 8 years in getting out of it." In stepping across the room, some sharp point in the floor pierced his foot, and stooping to examine it, he found that the wound had been inflicted by a long rusty nail which projected from the boards. Totally disregarding the pain, he picked up the nail and reserved it for future use, nor was he long in making it available. On examining the door, he found it secured by a large rusty lock, which he endeavored to pick with the nail he had just acquired. But all his efforts proving ineffectual, he removed the plate that covered it with the bar, and with his fingers contrived to draw back the bolt. Opening the door, he then stepped into a dark, narrow passage leading, as he was well aware, to the chapel. On the left there were doors communicating with the King's Bench ward and the Stone ward, 2 large holes on the master debtor's side. But Jack was too well versed in the geography of the place to attempt either of them. Indeed, if he had been ignorant of it, the sound of voices which he could faintly distinguish would have served as a caution to him. Hurrying on, his progress was soon checked by a strong door, several inches in thickness, and nearly as wide as the passage. Running his hand carefully over it in search of the lock, he perceived to his dismay that it was fastened on the other side. After several vain attempts to burst it open, he resolved, as a last alternative, to break through the wall in the part nearest to the lock. This was a much more serious task than he anticipated. The wall was of considerable thickness and built altogether of stone, and the noise he was compelled to make in using the heavy bar, which brought sparks with every splinter he struck off, was so great that he feared it must be heard by the prisoners on the debtor's side. Heedless, however, of the consequences, he pursued his task. Half an hour's labor, during which he was obliged more than once to pause to regain breath, sufficed to make a hole wide enough to allow a passage for his arm up to the elbow. In this way, he was able to force back a ponderous bolt from its socket, and to his unspeakable joy, found that the door instantly yielded. Once more cheered by daylight, he hastened forward and entered the chapel. This ends Chapter 18, The Red Room. Section 45 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 19, The Chapel. Situated at the upper part of the southeast angle of the jail, the chapel of Old Newgate was divided on the north side into 3 graded compartments, or pens as they were termed, allotted to the common debtors and felons. In the northwest angle there was a small pen for female offenders, and on the south a more commodious enclosure appropriated to the master debtors and strangers. Immediately beneath the pulpit stood a large circular pew where malefactors under sentence of death sat to hear the condemned sermon delivered to them, and where they formed a public spectacle to the crowds, which curiosity generally attracted on those occasions. To return, Jack had got into one of the pens at the north side of the chapel. The enclosure by which it was surrounded was about 12 feet high, the under part being composed of taken planks, the upper of a strong iron grating surmounted by sharp iron spikes. In the middle there was a gate. It was locked, but Jack speedily burst it open with the iron bar. Clearing the few impediments in his way, he soon reached the condemned pew, where it had once been his fate to sit, and extending himself on the seat, endeavored to snatch a moment's repose. It was denied him, for as he closed his eyes, though but for an instant, the whole scene of his former visit to the place rose before him. There he sat as before, with the heavy fetters on his limbs, and beside him sat his 3 companions, who had since expiated their offences on the gibbet. The chapel was again crowded with visitors, and every eye, even that of Jonathan Wild, who'd come thither to deride him, was fixed upon him. So perfect was the illusion that he could almost fancy he heard the solemn voice of the ordinary, warning him that his race was nearly run, and imploring him to prepare for eternity. From this perturbed state he was roused by thoughts of his mother, and fancying he heard her gentle voice urging him on to fresh exertion, he started up. On one side of a chapel there was a large grated window, but as it looked upon the interior of the jail, Jack preferred following the course he had originally decided upon to making any attempt in this quarter. Accordingly, he proceeded to a gate which stood upon the south and guarded the passage communicating with the leads. It was grated and crested with spikes, like that he had just burst open, and thinking it a needless waste of time to force it, he broke off one of the spikes, which he carried with him for further purposes, and then climbed over it. A short flight of steps brought him to a dark passage, into which he plunged. Here he found another strong door, making the 5th he had encountered. Well aware that the doors in this passage were much stronger than those in the entry he had just quitted, he was neither surprised nor dismayed to find it fastened by a lock of unusual size. After repeatedly trying to remove the plate, which was so firmly screwed down that it resisted all his efforts, and vainly attempting to pick it with a spike and nail, he at length, after half an hour's ineffectual labour, wrenched off the box by means of the iron bar, and the door, as he laughingly expressed it, became his humble servant. But this difficulty was only overcome to be succeeded by one still greater. Hastening along the passage, he came to the 6th door. For this he was prepared, but he was not prepared for the almost insurmountable obstacles which it presented. Running his hand hastily over it, he was startled to find it one complicated mass of bolts and bars. It seemed as if all the precautions previously taken were here accumulated. Anyone less courageous than himself would have abandoned the effort from a conviction of its utter hopelessness, but though it might for a moment damp his ardor, it could not deter him. Once again he passed his hand over the surface and carefully noted all the obstacles. There was a lock, apparently more than a foot wide, strongly plated, and girded to the door with thick iron hoops. Below it a prodigiously large bolt was shot into the socket, and, in order to keep it there, was fastened by a hasp, and further protected by an immense padlock. Besides this, the door was crossed and recrossed by iron bars, clenched by broad-headed nails. An iron fillet secured the socket of the bolt and the box of the lock to the main post of the doorway. Nothing disheartened by this survey, Jack set to work upon the lock, which he attacked with all his implements, now attempting to pick it with the nail, now to wrench it off with the bar, but all without effect. He not only failed in making any impression, but seemed to increase the difficulties, for after an hour's toil he had broken the nail and slightly bent the iron bar. Completely overcome by fatigue, with strained muscles and bruised hands, streaming with perspiration, and with lips so parched that he would gladly have parted with a treasure if he had possessed it for a draught of water, he sank against the wall, and while in this state was seized with a sudden and strange alarm. He fancied that the turnkeys had discovered his flight and were in pursuit of him, that they had climbed up the chimney, entered the red room, tracked him from door to door, and were now only detained by the gate which he had left unbroken in the chapel. He even thought he could detect the voice of Jonathan, urging and directing them. So strongly was he impressed with this idea, that grasping the iron bar with both hands, he dashed it furiously against the door, making the passage echo with blows. By degrees, his fears vanished, and hearing nothing, he grew calmer. His spirits revived, and encouraging himself with the idea that the present impediment, though the greatest, was the last, he set himself seriously to consider how it might best be overcome. On reflection, it occurred to him that he might perhaps be able to loosen the iron fillet, a notion no sooner conceived than executed. With incredible labor, and by the aid of both spike and nail, he succeeded in getting the point of the bar beneath the fillet. Exerting all his energies, and using the bar as a lever, he forced off the iron band, which was full 7 feet high, 7 inches wide, and 2 thick, and which brought with it in its fall the box of the lock and the socket of the bolt, leaving no further hindrance. Overjoyed beyond measure at having vanquished this apparently insurmountable obstacle, Jack darted through the door. This ends Chapter 19, The Chapel. Section 46 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 20. The Leads. Ascending a short flight of steps, Jack found at the summit a door, which being bolted in the inside, he speedily opened. The fresh air which blew in his face greatly revived him. He had now reached what was called the lower leads, a flat covering a part of the prison contiguous to the gateway, and surrounded on all sides by walls about 14 feet high. On the north stood the battlements of one of the towers of the gate. On this side a flight of wooden steps, protected by a handrail, led to a door opening upon the summit of the prison. This door was crested with spikes, and guarded on the right by a bristling semicircle of spikes. Hastily ascending these steps, Jack found the door, as he anticipated, locked. He could have easily forced it, but preferred a more expeditious mode of reaching the roof which suggested itself to him. Mounting the door he at last opened, he placed his hands on the wall above and quickly drew himself up. Just as he got on the roof of the prison, St. Sepulchre's clock struck 8. It was instantly answered by the deep note of St. Paul's, and the concert was prolonged by other neighboring churches. Jack had thus been 6 hours in accomplishing his arduous task. Though nearly dark, there was still light enough left to enable him to discern surrounding objects. Through the gloom he distinctly perceived the dome of St. Paul's, hanging like a black cloud in the air, and nearer to him he remarked the golden ball on the summit of the College of Physicians, compared by Garth to a gilded pill. Other towers and spires, St. Martin's on Ludgate Hill and Christ Church in Newgate Street, were also distinguishable. As he gazed down into the courts of the prison, he could not help shuddering, lest the false step might precipitate him below. To prevent the recurrence of any such escape as that just described, it was deemed expedient in more recent times to keep a watchman at the top of Newgate. Not many years ago, 2 men employed on this duty quarreled during the night, and in the morning their bodies were found stretched upon the pavement of the yard beneath. Proceeding along the wall, Jack reached the southern tower, over the battlements of which he clambered, and crossing it, dropped upon the roof of the gate. He then scaled the northern tower and made his way to the summit of that part of the prison which fronted Gilspur Street. Arrived at the extremity of the building, he found that it overlooked the flat roof of a house which, as far as he could judge in the darkness, lay at a depth of about 20 feet below. Not choosing to hazard so great a fall, Jack turned to examine the building, to see whether any more favorable point of descent presented itself, but could discover nothing but steep walls without a single available projection. As he looked around, he he beheld an incessant stream of passengers hurrying on below. Lights glimmered in the windows of the different houses, and a lamplighter was running from post to post on his way to Snow Hill. Finding it impossible to descend on any side without incurring serious risk, Jack resolved to return for his blanket, by the help of which he felt certain of accomplishing a safe landing on the roof of the house in Giltspur Street. Accordingly, he began to retrace his steps, and pursuing the course he had recently taken, scaling the two towers and passing along the wall of the prison, he descended by means of the door upon the lower leads. Before he re-entered the prison, he hesitated from a doubt whether he was not fearfully increasing his risk of capture, but convinced that he had no other alternative, he went on. During all this time he had never quitted the iron bar, and he now grasped it with the firm determination of selling his life dearly if he met with any opposition. A few seconds sufficed to clear the passage, through which it had previously cost him more than 2 hours to force his way. The floor was strewn with screws, nails, fragments of wood and stone, and across the passage lay the heavy iron fillet. He did not disturb any of this litter, but left it as a mark of his prowess. He was now at the entrance of the chapel, and striking the door over which he had previously climbed a violent blow with the bar, it flew open. To vault over the pews was the work of a moment, and having gained the entry leading to the Red Room, he passed through the first door, his progress being only impeded by the pile of broken stones which he himself had raised. Listening at one of the doors leading to the master debtor's side, he heard a loud voice chanting a bacchanalian melody, and the boisterous laughter that accompanied the song convinced him that no suspicion was entertained in this quarter. Entering the Red Room, he crept through the hole in the wall, descended the chimney, and arrived once more in his old place of captivity. How different were his present feelings compared with those he had experienced on quitting it. Then, though full of confidence, he half doubted his power of accomplishing his designs. Now he had achieved them, and felt assured of success. The vast heap of rubbish on the floor had been so materially increased by the bricks and plaster thrown down in his attack upon the wall of the Red Room that it was with some difficulty he could find the blanket which was almost buried beneath the pile. He next searched for his stockings and shoes, and when found, put them on. While he was thus employed, his nerves underwent a severe shock. A few bricks, dislodged probably by his last descent, came clattering down the chimney, and as it was perfectly dark, gave him the notion that someone was endeavoring to force an entrance into the room. But these fears, like those he had recently experienced, speedily vanished, and he prepared to return to the roof, congratulating himself that owing to the opportune falling of the bricks, he had in all probability escaped serious injury. Throwing the blanket over his left arm and shouldering the iron bar, he again clambered up the chimney, regained the Red Room, hurried along the first passage, crossed the chapel, threaded the entry to the lower leads, and in less than 10 minutes after quitting the castle, had reached the northern extremity of the prison. Previously to his descent, he had left the nail and spike on the wall, and with these he fastened the blanket to the stone coping. This done, he let himself carefully down by it, and having only a few feet to drop, alighted in safety. Having now fairly got out of Newgate for the second time, with a heart throbbing with exultation, he hastened to make good his escape. To his great joy, he found a small garret door in the roof of the opposite house open. He entered it, crossed the room, in which there was only a small truckle bed, over which he stumbled, opened another door, and gained the stairhead. As he was about to descend, his chain slightly rattled. "Oh, Lord, what's that?" exclaimed a female voice from an adjoining room. "Only the dog," replied the rough tones of a man. Securing the chain in the best way he could, Jack then hurried down 2 pair of stairs and had nearly reached the lobby when a door suddenly opened and two persons appeared, one of whom held a light. Retreating as quickly as he could, Jack opened the first door he came to, entered a room, and searching in the dark for some place of concealment, fortunately discovered a screen, behind which he crept. This ends Chapter 20, The Leads. Section 47 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 21. What Befell Jack Sheppard in the Turner's House. Jack was scarcely concealed when the door opened, and the two persons of whom he had caught a glimpse below entered the room. What was his astonishment to recognize in the few words they uttered the voices of Kneebone and Winifred. The latter was apparently in great distress, and the former seemed to be using his best efforts to relieve her anxiety. "How very fortunate it is," he observed, "that I happened to call upon Mr. Bird, the turner, to give him an order this evening. It was quite an unexpected pleasure to meet you and your worthy father." "Pray cease these compliments," returned Winifred, "and if you have any communication to make, do not delay it. You told me just now that you wished to speak a few words to me in private concerning Thames Darrell, and for that purpose I have left my father below with Mr. Bird and have come hither. What have you got to say?" "Too much," replied Kneebone, shaking his head. "Sadly, too much."
"Do not needlessly alarm me, I beseech you."
"Whatever your intelligence might be, I will strive to bear it, but do not awaken my apprehensions unless you have good cause for so doing. What do you know of Thames? Where is he?" "Don't agitate yourself, dearest girl," rejoined the woolen draper, "or I shall never be able to commence my relation." "I am calm, perfectly calm," replied Winifred. "Pray make no further mystery, but tell me all without reserve." "Since you require it, I must obey," replied Kneebone, "but prepare yourself for a terrible shock." "For mercy's sake, go on," cried Winifred. "At all hazards, then, you shall know the truth," replied the woolen draper, in a tone of affected solicitude. "But are you really prepared?" "Quite, quite," replied Winifred. "This suspense is worse than torture." "I am almost afraid to utter it," said Kneebone. "But Thames Darrell is murdered." "Murdered!" ejaculated Winifred. "Basely and inhumanly murdered by Jack Sheppard and Blueskin," continued Kneebone. "Oh, no, no, no!" cried Winifred. "I cannot believe it. You must be misinformed, Mr. Kneebone. Jack may be capable of much that is wicked, but he would never lift his hand against his friend. Of that I am assured." "Generous girl!" cried Jack from behind the screen. "I have proofs to the contrary," replied Kneebone. "The murder was committed after the robbery of my house by Sheppard and his accomplices. I did not choose to mention my knowledge of this fact to your worthy father, but you may rely on its correctness." "You were right not to mention it to him," rejoined Winifred, "for he is in such a state of distress at the mysterious disappearance of Mrs. Sheppard that I fear any further anxiety might prove fatal to him. And yet I know not, for the object of his visit here tonight was to serve Jack, who, if your statement is correct, which I cannot, however, for a moment believe, does not deserve his assistance." "You may rest assured he does not," rejoined Kneebone emphatically. "But I am at a loss to understand in what way your father proposes to assist him." "Mr. Bird, the turner, is an old friend of ours, has some acquaintance with the turnkeys of Newgate," replied Winifred, "and by his means my father hoped to convey some implements to Jack by which he might effect another escape." "I see," remarked Kneebone. "This must be prevented," he added to himself. "Heaven grant you may have been wrongly informed with respect to Thames," exclaimed Winifred. But I beseech you on no account to mention what you have told me to my poor father. He is not in a state of mind to bear it."
"Rely on me," rejoined Kneebone. "One word before we part, adorable girl. Only one," he continued, detaining her.
"I would not venture to renew my suit while Thames lived, because I well knew your affections were fixed upon him.
But now that this bar is removed, I trust I may, without impropriety, urge it."
"No more of this," said Winifred angrily. "Is this a season to speak on such a subject?"
"Perhaps not," rejoined the woolen draper,
"but the uncontrollable violence of my passion must plead my excuse. My whole life shall be devoted to you, beloved girl, and when you reflect how much at heart your poor mother, whose loss we must ever deplore, had our union, you will, I am persuaded, no longer refuse me."
"Sir!" exclaimed Winifred.
"You will make me the happiest of mankind," cried the woolen draper, falling on his knees and seizing her hand, which he devoured with kisses. "Let me go," cried Winifred. "I disbelieve the whole story you've told me." "By heaven," cried Kneebone with increasing fervour, "it is true as my affection for you."
"I do not doubt it," retorted Winifred scornfully, "because I attach credit neither to one nor the other. If Thames is murdered, you are his assassin. Let me go, sir."
The woolen draper made no answer, but hastily starting up, bolted the door. "What do you mean?" cried Winifred in alarm. "Nothing more than to obtain a favourable answer to my suit," replied Kneebone.
"This is not the way to obtain it," said Winifred, endeavouring to reach the door.
"You shall not go, adorable girl," cried Kneebone, catching her in his arms, "till you have answered me. You shall be mine."
"Never," replied Winifred.
"Release me instantly, or I will call my father." "Do so," replied Kneebone, "but remember the door is locked." "Monster!" cried Winifred. "Help! Help!"
"You call in vain," returned Kneebone.
"Not so," replied Jack, throwing down the screen. "Release her instantly, villain." Both Winifred and her suitor started at this sudden apparition. Jack, whose clothes were covered with dust, and whose face was deathly pale from his recent exertion, looked more like a phantom than a living person. "In the devil's name, is that you, Jack?" ejaculated Kneebone.
"It is," replied Sheppard.
"You've uttered a wilful and deliberate falsehood in asserting that I have murdered Thames, for whom you well know I would lay down my life. Retract your words instantly, or take the consequences."
"What should I retract, villain?" cried the woolen draper, who at the sound of Jack's voice had regained his confidence.
"To the best of my belief, Thames Darrell has been murdered by you."
"A lie!" exclaimed Jack in a terrible tone, and before Kneebone could draw his sword, he felled him to the ground with the iron bar.
"You've killed him!" cried Winifred in alarm.
"No," answered Jack, approaching her, though if I had done so, he would have merited his fate.
"You do not believe his statement?"
"I do not," replied Winifred. "I could not believe you capable of so foul a deed.
But, oh, by what wonderful chance have you come hither so seasonably?"
"I have just escaped from Newgate," replied Jack, "and am more than repaid for the severe toil I have undergone in being able to save you. But tell me," he added with much anxiety, "has nothing been heard of Thames since the night of my former escape?"
"Nothing whatever," answered Winifred. "He left Dollis Hill at 10 o'clock on that night, and has not since returned. My father has made every possible inquiry and offered large rewards, but has not been able to discover the slightest trace of him. His suspicions at first fell upon you, but he has since acquitted you of any share in it." "Oh, heaven!" exclaimed Jack. "He's been indefatigable in his search," continued Winifred, "and has even journeyed to Manchester. But though he visited Sir Rowland Trenchard's seat, Ashton Hall, he could gain no tidings of him or of his uncle Sir Rowland, who, it seems, has left the country.
Never to return, remarked Jack gloomily. Before tomorrow morning I will ascertain what has become of Thames, or perish in the attempt. And now tell me what has happened to my poor mother.
Ever since your last capture and Thames' mysterious disappearance, she's been dreadfully ill, replied Winifred, so ill that each day was expected to be her last. She's also been afflicted with occasional returns of her terrible malady. On Tuesday night she was rather better, and I'd left her for a short time, as I thought, asleep on the sofa in the little parlour of which she is so fond.
Well, exclaimed Jack.
On my return I found the window open and the room vacant. She was gone.
Did you discover any trace of footsteps? Inquired Jack eagerly.
There were some marks near the window, but whether recently made or not could not be ascertained, replied Winifred.
Oh God! Exclaimed Jack, in a tone of the bitterest anguish.
My worst fears are realized. She's in Wilde's power.
I ought to add, continued Winifred, that one of her shoes was picked up in the garden, and that prints of her feet were discovered along the soft mould. Whether made in flying from anyone, or from rushing forth in distracted terror, it is impossible to say.
My father thought the latter. He has had the whole country searched, but hitherto without success.
I know where she will be found, and how, rejoined Jack with a shudder.
I have something further to tell you, pursued Winifred. Shortly after your last visit to Dollis Hill, my father was one evening waylaid by a man who informed him that he had something to communicate respecting Thames, and had a large sum of money and some important documents to deliver to him, which would be given up, provided he would undertake to procure your liberation.
It was Blueskin, observed Jack.
So my father thought, replied Winifred, and he therefore instantly fired upon him. But though the shot took effect, as was evident from the stains on the ground, the villain escaped.
Your father did right, replied Jack with some bitterness.
But if he had not fired that shot, he might have saved Thames, and possessed himself of papers which would have established his birth and his right to the estates of the Trenchard family.
Would you have had him spare my mother's murderer? Cried Winifred.
Oh, no, replied Jack.
And yet,
but it is only part of a chain of ill luck that seems wound around me. Listen to me, Winifred. And he hastily related the occurrences in Jonathan Wild's house. The account of the discovery of Sir Rowland's murder filled Winifred with alarm, but when she learnt what had befallen Thames, how he had been stricken down by the thief-taker's bludgeon and left for dead, she uttered a piercing scream, fainted, and would have fallen if Jack had not caught her in his arms. Jack had well nigh fallen, too. The idea that he held in his arms the girl whom he had once so passionately loved, and for whom he still retained an ardent but hopeless attachment, almost overcame him. Gazing at her with eyes blinded with tears, he imprinted one brotherly kiss upon her lips. It was the first and the last. At this juncture the handle of the door was tried, and the voice of Mr. Wood was heard without, angrily demanding admittance. "What's the matter?" he cried. "I thought I heard a scream. Why is the door fastened? Open it directly." "Are you alone?" asked Jack, mimicking the voice of Kneebone. "What for?" demanded Wood. "Open the door, I say, or I'll burst it open." Carefully depositing Winifred on a sofa, Jack then extinguished the light, and as he unfastened the door, crept behind it. In rushed Mr. Wood with a candle in his hand, which Jack instantly blew out and darted downstairs. He upset someone, probably Mr. Bird, who was rushing upstairs, alarmed by Mr. Wood's cries. But regardless of this, he darted along a passage, gained the shop, and passed through an open door into the street. and thus he was once more free, having effected one of the most wonderful escapes ever planned or accomplished. This ends chapter 21, What Befell Jack Sheppard in the Turner's House. Section 48 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 22, Fast and Loose. About 7 o'clock on the same night, Jonathan Wild's 2 Janissaries, who'd been for some time in attendance in the hall of his dwelling at the Old Bailey, were summoned to the audience chamber. A long and secret conference then took place between the thief-taker and his myrmidons, after which they were severally dismissed. Left alone, Jonathan lighted a lamp, and, opening the trap-door, descended the secret stairs. Taking the opposite course from that which he had hitherto pursued when it has been necessary to attend him in his visits to the lower part of his premises, he struck into a narrow passage on the right, which he tracked till he came to a small door, like the approach to a vault. Unlocking it, he entered the chamber, which by no means belied its external appearance. On a pallet in one corner lay a pale, emaciated female. Holding the lamp over her rigid but beautiful features, Jonathan, with some anxiety, placed his hand upon her breast to ascertain whether the heart still beat. Satisfied with his scrutiny, he produced a pocket flask, and taking off the silver cup with which it was mounted, filled it with the contents of the flask, and then seizing the thin arm of the sleeper, rudely shook it. Opening her large black eyes, she fixed them upon him for a moment with a mixture of terror and loathing, and then averted her gaze. "Drink this," cried Jonathan, handing her the cup. "You'll feel better after it." Mechanically raising the potion to her lips, the poor creature swallowed it without hesitation. "Is it poison?" she asked. "No," replied Jonathan, with a brutal laugh. "I'm not going to get rid of you just yet. It's gin, a liquor you used to like. You'll find the benefit of it by and by. You've a good deal to go through tonight." "Ah," exclaimed Mrs. Sheppard, "are you come to renew your terrible proposals?" "I'm come to execute my threats," replied Wild. "Tonight you shall be my wedded wife." "I will die first," replied Mrs. Sheppard. "You may die afterwards as soon as you please," retorted Jonathan. "But live till then you shall. I've sent for the priest." "Mercy!" cried Mrs. Sheppard, vainly trying to discover a gleam of compassion in the thief-taker's inexorable countenance. "Mercy! Mercy!" "Pshaw!" rejoined Jonathan. "You should be glad to be made an honest woman." "Oh, let me die," groaned the widow. "I've not many days, perhaps not many hours to live, but kill me rather than commit this outrage." "That wouldn't answer my purpose," replied Jonathan savagely. "I didn't carry you off from Old Wood to kill you, but to wed you." "What motive can you have for so vile a deed?" asked Mrs. Sheppard. "You know my motive well enough," answered Jonathan. "However, I'll refresh your memory. I once might have married you for your beauty. Now I marry you for your wealth." "My wealth?" replied Mrs. Sheppard. "I've nothing." "You are heiress to the Trenchard property," rejoined Jonathan, "one of the largest estates in Lancashire." "Not while Thames Darrell and Sir Rowland live." "Sir Rowland is dead," replied Jonathan gloomily. "Thames Darrell only waits my mandate to follow him. Before our marriage there will be no life between you and the estates." "Ah!" exclaimed Mrs. Sheppard. "Look here," cried Jonathan, stooping down and taking hold of a ring in the floor, with which by a great effort he raised up a flag. "In this pit," he added, pointing to the chasm below, "your brother is buried. Here your nephew will speedily be thrown." "Horrible!" cried Mrs. Sheppard, shuddering violently. "But your dreadful projects will recoil on your own head. Heaven will not permit the continuance of such wickedness as you practice."
"I'll take my chance," replied Jonathan, with a sinister smile. "My schemes have succeeded tolerably well hitherto."
"A day of retribution will assuredly arrive," rejoined Mrs. Sheppard.
"Till then, I shall remain content," returned Wilde. "And now, Mrs. Sheppard, attend to what I am about to say to you. Years ago, when you were a girl and in the bloom of your beauty, I loved you."
"Loved me? You?"
"I loved you," continued Jonathan, "and struck by your appearance, which seemed above your station, inquired your history, and found you had been stolen by a gipsy in Lancashire. I proceeded to Manchester to investigate the matter further, and when there ascertained beyond a doubt that you were the eldest daughter of Sir Montacute Trenchard. This discovery made, I hastened back to London to offer you my hand, but found you had married in the meantime a smock-faced, smooth-tongued carpenter named Sheppard. The important secret remained locked in my breast, but I resolved to be avenged. I swore I would bring your husband to the gallows, would plunge you in such want, such distress, that you should have no alternative but the last frightful resource of misery. And I also swore that if you had a son, he should share the same fate as his father."
"And terribly you've kept your vow," replied Mrs. Sheppard.
"I have," replied Jonathan, "but I am now coming to the point which most concerns you. Consent to become my wife, and do not compel me to have recourse to violence to effect my purpose, and I will spare your son." Mrs. Sheppard looked fixedly at him, as if she would penetrate the gloomy depth of his soul.
"Swear that you will do this," she cried.
"I swear it," rejoined Jonathan, readily.
"But what is an oath to you?" cried the widow distrustfully. "You will not hesitate to break it if it suits your purpose. I've suffered too much from your treachery. I will not trust you."
"As you please," replied Jonathan sternly. "Recollect you are in my power. Jack's life hangs on your determination."
"What shall I do?" cried Mrs. Sheppard, in a voice of agony.
"Save him," replied Jonathan. "You can do so."
"Bring him here. Let me see him. Let me embrace him. Let me be assured that he's safe, and I'm yours, I swear it."
Exclaimed Jonathan.
"You hesitate. You are deceiving me."
"By my soul, no," replied Jonathan, with affected sincerity. "You shall see him tomorrow."
"Delay the wedding till then. I will never consent till I see him."
"You ask impossibilities," replied Jonathan sullenly. "All is prepared. The marriage cannot, shall not be delayed. You must be mine tonight."
"Force shall not make me yours till Jack is free," replied the widow resolutely.
"An hour hence I shall return with the priest," replied Jonathan, striding towards the door. And with a glance of malignant exultation, he quitted the vault and locked the door.
"An hour hence I shall be beyond your malice," said Mrs. Sheppard, sinking backwards upon the pallet.
This ends chapter 22, Fast and Loose. Section 49 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 23. The Last Meeting Between Jack Sheppard and His Mother. After escaping from the Turner's house, Jack Sheppard skirted St. Sepulchre's Church, and hurrying down Snow Hill, darted into the first turning on the left. Traversing Angel Court and Green Arbor Court,
Celebrated as one of Goldsmith's retreats, he speedily reached Seacole Lane, and pursuing the same course which he and Thames had formerly taken, arrived at the yard at the back of Jonathan's habitation. A door, it may be remembered, opened from Wilde's dwelling into this yard. Before he forced an entrance, Jack tried it, and, to his great surprise and delight, found it unfastened. Entering the house, he found himself in a narrow passage leading to the back stairs. He had not taken many steps when he perceived Quilt Arnold in the upper gallery with a lamp in his hand. Hearing a noise below, Quilt called out, supposing it occasioned by the Jew. Jack hastily retreated, and taking the first means of concealment that occurred to him, descended the cellar steps. Quilt, meanwhile, came down, examined the door, and finding it unfastened, locked it with a bitter imprecation on his brother Janizary's carelessness. This done, he followed the course which Jack had just taken. As he crossed the cellar, he passed so near to Jack, who had concealed himself behind a piece of furniture, that he almost touched him. It was Jack's intention to have knocked him down with the iron bar, but he was so struck with the Janizary's looks that he determined to spare him till he had ascertained his purpose. With this view, he suffered him to pass on. Quilt's manner indeed was that of a man endeavouring to muster up sufficient resolution for the commission of some desperate crime. He halted, looked fearfully around, stopped again, and exclaimed aloud, "I don't like the job, and yet it must be done, or Mr. Wilde will hang me." With this he appeared to pluck up his courage, and stepped forward more boldly. "Some dreadful deed is about to be committed, which I may perhaps prevent," muttered Jack to himself. "Heaven grant that I may not be too late." Followed by Jack Sheppard, who kept sufficiently near to him to watch his proceedings and yet not expose himself, Quilt unlocked one or two doors which he left open, and after winding his way along a gloomy passage, arrived at the door of a vault. Here he set down the lamp and took out a key, and as he did so the expression of his countenance was so atrocious that Jack felt assured he was not wrong in his suspicions. By this time the door was unlocked, and drawing his sword, Quilt entered the cell. The next moment an exclamation was heard in the voice of Thames. Darting forward at this sound, Jack threw open the door and beheld Quilt kneeling over Thames, whose hands and feet were bound with cords, and about to plunge his sword into his breast. A blow from the iron bar instantly stretched the ruffian on the floor. Jack then proceeded to liberate the captive from his bondage. "Jack," exclaimed Thames, "is it you?" "It is," replied Sheppard, as he untied the cords. "I might return the question. Were it not for your voice, I don't think I should know you. You are greatly altered." Captivity had indeed produced a striking alteration in Thames. He looked like the shadow of himself, thin, feeble, hollow-eyed, his beard unshaven. Nothing could be more miserable. "I have never been out of this horrible dungeon since we last met," he said, "though how long ago that is I scarcely know. Night and day have been alike to me." 6 weeks have elapsed since that fatal night," replied Jack. "During the whole of that time I have been a close prisoner in Newgate, whence I have only just escaped." "6 weeks!" exclaimed Thames, in a melancholy tone. "It seems like 6 long months to me." "I do not doubt it," returned Jack. "None but those who have experienced it can understand the miseries of imprisonment." "Do not speak of it," rejoined Thames, with a look of horror. "Let us fly from this frightful place." "I will conduct you to the outlet," replied Jack, "but I cannot leave till I have ascertained whether my mother also is a prisoner here." "I can answer that," replied Thames. "She is. The monster Wilde, when he visited my dungeon last night, told me, to add to my misery, that she occupied a cell near me." "Arm yourself with that ruffian's weapons," replied Jack, "and let us search for her." Thames complied, but he was so feeble that it seemed scarcely possible he could offer any effectual resistance in case of an attack.
"Lean on me," said Jack.
Taking the light, they then proceeded along the passage. There was no other door in it, and Jack therefore struck into another entry which branched off to the right. They had not proceeded far when a low moan was heard. "She's here!" cried Jack, darting forward. A few steps brought him to the door of the vault in which his mother was immured. It was locked. Jack had brought away the bunch of keys which he'd taken from Quilt Arnold, but none of them would open it. He was therefore obliged to use the iron bar, which he did with as much caution as circumstances would permit. At the first blow, Mrs. Sheppard uttered a piercing scream.
"Wretch!" she cried, "you shall not force me to your hateful purpose. I will never wed you. I have a weapon, a knife, and if you attempt to open the door, will plunge it to my heart."
"Oh God!" exclaimed Jack, paralyzed by her cries. "What shall I do? If I persist, I shall destroy her."
"Get in," continued Mrs. Sheppard with a frenzied laugh. "You shall never behold me alive."
"Mother!" cried Jack in a broken voice. "It is your son!"
"It's false!" cried Mrs. Sheppard. "Think not to deceive me, monster. I know my son's voice too well. He's in Newgate. Hence!"
"Mother! Dear mother!" cried Jack, in a voice the tones of which were altered by his very anxiety to make them distinct. "Listen to me. I have broken from prison and am come to save you."
"It is not Jack's voice," rejoined Mrs. Sheppard. "I am not to be deceived. The knife is at my breast. Stir a foot, and I strike."
"Oh, heavens!" cried Jack, driven to his wits' end. "Mother, dear mother, once again I beseech you to listen to me. I am come to rescue you from Wilde's violence. I must break open the door. Hold your hand for a moment."
"You've heard my fixed determination, villain," cried Mrs. Sheppard. "I know my life is valuable to you, or you would not spare it. But I will not disappoint you. Get you gone. Your purposes are defeated."
"Footsteps are approaching," cried Thames.
"Heed her not. It's but a wild threat."
"I know not how to act," exclaimed Jack, almost driven to desperation.
"I hear you plotting with your wicked associates," cried Mrs. Sheppard. "I've baffled you."
"Force the door," said Thames, "or you will be too late." "Better she die by her own hand than by that monster's," cried Jack, brandishing the bar. "Mother, I come to you." With this he struck the door a heavy blow. He listened. There was a deep groan and the sound of a fall within. "I've killed her," exclaimed Jack, dropping the bar. "By your advice, Thames." "Oh God, pardon me." "Do not delay," cried Thames. "She may yet be saved. I am too weak to aid you." Jack again seized the bar, and dashing it furiously against the door, speedily burst it open. The unfortunate woman was stretched upon the floor with a bloody knife in her hand. "Mother!" cried Jack, springing towards her.
"Jack!" she cried,
raising her head.
"Is it you?"
"It is," replied her son. "Oh, why would you not listen to me?"
"I was distracted," replied Mrs. Sheppard faintly.
"I have killed you," cried Jack, endeavoring to staunch the effusion of blood from her breast. "Forgive me."
"I've nothing to forgive," replied Mrs. Sheppard. "I alone am to blame."
"Can I not carry you where you can obtain help?" cried Jack in an agony of distress.
"It's useless," replied Mrs. Sheppard. "Nothing can save me. I die happy, quite happy in beholding you. Do not remain with me. You may fall into the hands of your enemy. Fly!
Fly! Do not think of me, mother, but of yourself," cried Jack in an agony of tears.
"You've always been far dearer to me than myself," replied Mrs. Sheppard. "But I have one last request to make. Let me lie in Willesden churchyard." "You shall, answered Jack. "We shall meet again ere long, my son," cried Mrs. Sheppard, fixing her glazing eyes upon him. "Oh God, she is dying!" exclaimed Jack in a voice suffocated by emotion. "Forgive me! Oh, forgive me!" "Forgive you? Bless you!" she gasped. A cold shiver ran through her frame, and her gentle spirit passed away forever. "Oh God, that I might die too!" cried Jack, falling on his knees beside her. After the first violent outbreak of grief had in some degree subsided, Thames addressed him. "You must not remain here," he said. "You can render no further service to your poor mother." "I can avenge her!" cried Jack in a terrible tone. "Be ruled by me," returned Thames. "You will act most in accordance with her wishes, could she dictate them, by compliance. Do not waste time in vain regrets, but let us remove the body that we may fulfill her last injunctions." After some further arguments, Jack assented to this proposal. "Go on first with the light," he said. "I will bear the body." And he raised it in his arms. Just as they reached the end of the passage, they heard the voices of Jonathan and the Jew in Thames' late place of confinement. Wilde had evidently discovered the body of Quilt Arnold, and was loudly expressing his anger and astonishment. "Extinguish the light!" cried Jack. "Turn to the left! Quick! Quick!" The order was only just given in time. They scarcely gained the adjoining cellar when Jonathan and the Jew rushed past in the direction of the vault. "Not a moment is to be lost!" cried Jack. "Follow me!" So saying, he hurried upstairs, opened the back door, and was quickly in the yard. Having ascertained that Thames was at his heels, he hurried with his ghastly burden down Seacoal Lane. "Where are you going?" cried Thames, who, though wholly disencumbered, was scarcely able to keep up with him. "I know not, and care not," replied Jack. At this moment the coach passed them, and was instantly hailed by Thames. "You had better let me convey her to Dollis Hill," he said. "Be it so," replied Jack. Luckily it was so dark, and there was no lamp near, that the man did not notice the condition of the body, which was placed in the vehicle by the two young men. "What will you do?" asked Thames. "Leave me to my fate," rejoined Jack. "Take care of your charge." "Doubt me not," replied Thames. "Bury her in Willesden churchyard, as she requested, on Sunday," said Jack. "I will be there at the time." So saying, he closed the door. The coachman, having received his order, and being offered an extra fare if he drove quickly, set off at full speed. As Jack departed, a dark figure emerging from behind a wall rushed after him. This ends chapter 23, the last meeting between Jack Sheppard and his mother. Section 50 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 24, The Pursuit. After running to some distance down Seacoal Lane, Jack stopped to give a last look at the vehicle which was bearing away the remains of his beloved and ill-fated mother. It was scarcely out of sight when two persons whom he instantly recognized as Jonathan and Abraham Mendez turned the corner of a street and made it evident from their shouts that they likewise perceived him. Starting off at a rapid pace, Jack dashed down Turnagain Lane, skirted the eastern bank of Fleet Ditch, crossed Holborn Bridge, and began to ascend the neighboring hill. By the time he had reached St. Andrew's Church, his pursuers had gained the bridge,
and the attention of such passengers as crowded the streets was attracted towards him by their vociferations. Amongst others, the watchman whose box was placed against the churchyard wall near the entrance to Shoe Lane rushed out and sprung his rattle, which was immediately answered by another rattle from Holborn bars. Darting down Field Lane, Jack struck into a labyrinth of streets on the left, but though he ran as swiftly as he could, he was not unperceived. His course had been observed by the watchman, who directed Wilde which way to take. "It's Jack Sheppard, the noted housebreaker!" cried Jonathan, at the top of his sonorous voice. "He's just broken out of Newgate. After him! £100 to the man who takes him!" Sheppard's name operated like magic on the crowd. The cry was echoed by 20 different voices. People ran out of their shops to join the pursuit, and by the time Wilde had got into Field Lane, he had a troop of 50 persons at his heels, all eager to assist in the capture. "Stop, thief!" roared Jonathan, who perceived the fugitive hurrying along a street towards Hatton Garden. "It's Sheppard! Jack Sheppard! Stop him!" And his shouts were reiterated by the pack of bloodhounds at his heels. Jack, meanwhile, heard the shouts, and though alarmed by them, held on a steady course. By various twistings and turnings, during all which time his pursuers, who were greatly increased in numbers, kept him in view, he reached Gray's Inn Lane. Here he was hotly pursued. Fatigued by his previous exertions, and encumbered by his fetters, he was by no means, though ordinarily remarkably swift of foot, a match for his foes, who were fast gaining upon him. At the corner of Liquor Pond Street stood the old Hampstead coach office, and on the night in question, a knot of ostlers, wagoners, drivers, and stable boys was collected in the yard. Hearing the distant shouts, these fellows rushed down to the entrance of the court and arrived there just as Jack passed it. "Stop, thief!" roared Jonathan. "Stop, thief!" clamored the rabble behind. At no loss to comprehend that Jack was the individual pointed out by these outcries, 2 of the nearest of the group made a dash at him, but Jack eluded their grasp. A large dog was then set at him by a stable boy, but striking the animal with his faithful iron bar, he speedily sent him yelping back. The 2 ostlers, however, kept close at his heels, and Jack, whose strength began to flag, feared he could not hold much longer. Determined, however, not to be taken with life, he held on. Still keeping ahead of his pursuers, he ran along the direct road till the houses disappeared and he got into the open country. Here he was preparing to leap over the hedge into the fields on the left, when he was intercepted by 2 horsemen, who, hearing the shouts, rode up and struck at him with the butt ends of their heavy riding whips. Warding off the blows as well as he could with the bar, Jack struck both the horses on the head, and the animals plunged so violently that they not only prevented the riders from assailing him, but also kept off the hostlers, and in the confusion that ensued, Jack managed to spring over the fence and shaped his course across the field in the direction of Sir John Oldcastle's. The stoppage had materially lessened the distance between him and his pursuers, who now amounted to more than 100 persons, many of whom carried lanterns and links. Ascertaining that it was Sheppard of whom this concourse was in pursuit, the 2 horsemen leapt the hedge and were presently close upon him. Like a hare closely pressed, Jack attempted to double, but the device only brought him nearer his foes, who were crossing the field in every direction and rending the air with their shouts. The uproar was tremendous, men yelling, dogs barking, but above all was heard the stentorious voice of Jonathan, urging them on. Jack was so harassed that he felt half inclined to stand at bay. While he was straining every sinew, his foot slipped, and he fell head foremost into a deep trench which he had not observed in the dark. This fall saved him, for the horseman passed over him. Creeping along quickly on his hands and knees, he found the entrance to a covered drain, into which he crept. He was scarcely concealed when he heard the horsemen, who perceived they had overshot their mark, ride back. By this time Jonathan and the vast mob attending him had come up, and the place was rendered almost as light as day by the lynx.
"He must be somewhere hereabouts," cried one of the horsemen, dismounting. "We were close upon him when he suddenly disappeared." Jonathan made no answer, but snatching a torch from a bystander, jumped into the trench and commenced a diligent search. Just as he had arrived at the mouth of a drain, and Jack felt certain he must be discovered, a loud shout was raised from the further end of the field that the fugitive was caught. All the assemblage, accompanied by Jonathan, set off in this direction, when it turned out that the supposed housebreaker was a harmless beggar who'd been found asleep under a hedge. Jonathan's vexation at the disappointment was expressed in the bitterest imprecations, and he returned as speedily as he could to the trench. But he had now lost the precise spot, and thinking he had examined the drain, turned his attention to another quarter. Meanwhile, the excitement of a chase had in some degree subsided. The crowd dispersed in different directions, and most fortunately a heavy shower coming on put them all together to flight. Jonathan, however, still lingered. He seemed wholly insensible to the rain, though it presently descended in torrents, and continued his search as ardently as before. After occupying himself thus for the best part of an hour, he thought Jack must have given him the slip. Still, his suspicions were so strong that he ordered Mendez to remain on guard near the spot all night, and by the promise of a large reward induced 2 other men to keep him company. As he took his departure, he whispered to the Jew,
"Take him dead or alive, but if we fail now, and you heard him aright in Seacoal Lane, we are sure of him at his mother's funeral on Sunday." This ends chapter 24, The Pursuit.
Section 51 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 25. How Jack Sheppard got rid of his irons. About an hour after this, Jack ventured to emerge from his place of concealment. It was still raining heavily and profoundly dark. Drenched to the skin, in fact, he'd been lying in a bed of muddy water, and chilled to the very bone, he felt so stiff that he could scarcely move. Listening attentively, he fancied he heard the breathing of someone near him, and moved cautiously in the opposite direction. In spite of his care, he came in contact with a man who, endeavoring to grasp him, cried in the voice of Mendez, "Who goes there? Speak, or I fire!" No answer being returned, the Jew instantly discharged his pistol, and though the shot did no damage, the flash discovered Sheppard. But as the next moment all was profound darkness, Jack easily managed to break away from them. Without an idea where he was going, Jack pursued his way through the fields, and as he proceeded, the numbness of his limbs in some degree wore off, and his confidence returned. He had need of all the inexhaustible energy of his character to support him through his toilsome walk over the wet grass or along the slippery ploughed land. At last he got into a lane, but had not proceeded far when he was again alarmed by the sound of a horse's tread. Once more breaking through the hedge, he took to the fields. He was now almost driven to despair. Wet as he was, he felt as if he lay down in the grass he should perish with cold, while if he sought a night's lodging in any asylum, his dress, stained with blood and covered with dirt, would infallibly cause him to be secured and delivered into the hands of justice. And then the fetters, which were still upon his legs. How was he to get rid of them? Tired and dispirited, he still wandered on. Again returning to the main road, he passed through Clapton, and turning off on the left, arrived at the foot of Stamford Hill. He walked on for an hour longer, till he could scarcely drag one leg after another. At length he fell down on the road, fully expecting each moment would prove his last. How long he continued thus he scarcely knew, but just before dawn he managed to regain his legs, and crawling up a bank, perceived he was within 1/4 of a mile of Tottenham. A short way off in the field he descried a sort of shed or cow-house, and thither he contrived to drag his weary limbs. Opening the door, he found it littered with straw, on which he threw himself and instantly fell asleep. When he awoke, it was late in the day and raining heavily. For some time he could not stir, but felt sick and exhausted. His legs were dreadfully swelled, his hands bruised, and his fetters occasioned him intolerable pain. His bodily suffering, however, was nothing compared with his mental anguish. All the events of the previous day rushed to his recollection, and though he had been unintentionally the cause of his mother's death, he reproached himself as severely as if he'd been her actual murderer. "Had I not been the guilty wretch I am," he cried, bursting into an agony of tears, "she would never have died thus." This strong feeling of remorse, having found a natural vent, in some degree subsided, and he addressed himself to his present situation. Rousing himself, he went to the door. It had ceased raining, but the atmosphere was moist and chill, and the ground deluged by the recent showers. Taking up a couple of large stones which lay near, Jack tried to beat the round basils of the fetters into an oval form, so as to enable him to slip his heels through them. While he was thus employed, a farming man came into the barn. Jack instantly started to his feet, and the man, alarmed at his appearance, ran off to a neighboring house. Before he could return, Jack had made good his retreat, and wandering about the lanes and hedges, kept out of sight as much as possible. On examining his pockets, he found about 20 guineas in gold and some silver, but how to avail himself of it was the question, for in his present garb he was sure to be recognized. When night fell, he crept into the town of Tottenham. As he passed along the main thoroughfare, he heard his own name pronounced, and found that it was a hawker crying a penny history of his escapes. A crowd was collected round the fellow, who was rapidly disposing of his stock. "Here's the full, true, and particular account of Jack Sheppard's last astonishing and never-to-be-forgotten escape from the castle of Newgate," bawled the hawker, "with a print of him taken from the life, showing the manner how he was shackled and handcuffed. Only 1 penny. 2 copies, 2 pence. Thank you, sir. Here's the—" "Let me have one," cried a servant maid, running across the street, and in her haste forgetting to shut the door. "Here's the money. Master and Missus have been talking all day long about Jack Sheppard, and I'm dying to read his life." "Here you have it, my dear," returned the hawker. "Sold again." "If you don't get back quickly, Lucy," observed a bystander, "Jack Sheppard will be in the house before you." This sally occasioned a general laugh. "If Jack would come to my house, I'd contrive to hide him," remarked a buxom dame. "Poor fellow, I'm glad he's escaped." "Jack seems to be a great favourite with the fair sex," observed a smirking grocer's apprentice. "Of course," rejoined the bystander who had just spoken, and who was of a cynical tone. "The greater the rascal, the better they like him." "Here's a particular account of Jack's many robberies and escapes," roared the hawker. "How he broke into the house of his master, Mr. Wood, at Dollis Hill." "Let me have one," said a carpenter, who was passing by at the moment. "Mr. Wood was an old friend of mine, and I recollect seeing Jack when he was bound prentice to him." "A penny, if you please, sir," said the hawker. "Sold again. Here you have the full, true, and particular account of the barbarous murder committed by Jack Sheppard and his associate Joseph Blake, alias Blueskin, upon the body of Mrs. Wood." "That's false!" cried a voice behind him. The man turned at the exclamation, and so did several of the bystanders, but they could not make out who had uttered it. Jack, who'd been lingering near the group, now walked on. In the middle of the little town stood the shop of a Jew dealer in old clothes. The owner was at the door unhooking a few articles of wearing apparel which he had exposed outside for sale. Amongst other things, he had just brought down an old laced bavaroy, a species of surtout much worn at the period.
"What do you want for that coat, friend?" asked Jack as he came up. "More than you'll pay for it, friend," snuffled the Jew. "How do you know that?" rejoined Jack. "Will you take a guinea for it?" "Double that sum might tempt me," replied the Jew. "It's a nobleman's coat upon my shawl." "Here's the money," replied Jack, taking the coat. "Shall I help you on with it, sir?" replied the Jew, becoming suddenly respectful. "No," replied Jack. "I half suspect this is a highwayman," thought the Jew. "He's so ready with his cash. I found some other things inside, sir, which you might wish to buy. Some pistols." Jack was about to comply, but not liking the man's manner, he walked on. Further on there was a small chandler's shop, where Jack observed an old woman seated at the counter, attended by a little girl. Seeing provisions in the window, Jack ventured in and bought a loaf. Having secured this, for he was almost famished, he said that he had lost a hammer and wished to purchase one. The old woman told him she had no such article to dispose of, but recommended him to a neighboring blacksmith. Guided by the glare of the forge, which threw a stream of ruddy light across the road, Jack soon found the place of which he was in search. Entering the workshop, he found the blacksmith occupied in heating the tire of a cartwheel. Suspending his labor on Jack's appearance, the man demanded his business. Making up a similar story to that which he had told the old woman, he said he wanted to purchase a hammer and a file. The man looked hard at him. "Answer me one question first," he said. "I half suspect you're Jack Sheppard." "I am," replied Jack, without hesitation, for he felt assured from the man's manner that he might confide in him. "You're a bold fellow, Jack," rejoined the blacksmith, "but you've done well to trust me. I'll take off your irons, for I guess that's the reason why you want the hammer and file, on one condition." "What is it?" "That you'll give him to me." "Readily." Taking Jack into a shed behind the workshop, the smith in a short time freed him from his fetters. He not only did this, but supplied him with an ointment which allayed the swelling of his limbs, and crowned all by furnishing him with a jug of excellent ale. "I'm afraid, Jack, you'll come to the gallows," observed the smith. "But if you do, I'll go to Tyburn to see you. But I'll never part with your irons." Noticing the draggled condition Jack was in, he then fetched him a bucket of water, with which Jack cleansed himself as well as he could, and thanking the honest smith, who would take nothing for his trouble, left the shop. Having made a tolerably good meal upon the loaf, overcome by fatigue, Jack turned into a barn in Stoke Newington, and slept till late in the day, when he awakened much refreshed. The swelling in his limbs had also subsided. It rained heavily all day, so he did not stir forth. Towards night, however, he ventured out and walked on towards London. When he arrived at Hoxton, he found the walls covered with placards offering a reward for his apprehension, and he everywhere appeared to be the general subject of conversation. From a knot of idlers at a public-house, he learned that Jonathan Wild had just ridden past, and that his setters were scouring the country in every direction. Entering London, he bent his way towards the West End, and having some knowledge of a second-hand tailor's shop in Rupert Street, proceeded thither, and looked out a handsome suit of mourning, with a sword, cloak, and hat, and demanded the price. The man asked 12 guineas, but after a little bargaining he came down to 10. Taking his new purchase under his arm, Jack proceeded to a small tavern in the same street, where, having ordered dinner, he went to a bedroom to attire himself. He had scarcely completed his toilet when he was startled by a noise at the door, and heard his own name pronounced in no friendly accents. Fortunately, the window was not far from the ground, so, opening it gently, he dropped into a backyard, and from thence got into the street. Hurrying down the Haymarket,
He was arrested by a crowd who were collected round a street singer. Jack paused for a moment and found that his own adventures formed the subject of the ballad. Not daring, however, to listen to it, he ran on. This ends chapter 25, How Jack Sheppard Got Rid of His Irons.
Section 52 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 26. How Jack Sheppard Attended His Mother's Funeral. That night Jack walked to Paddington and took up his quarters at a small tavern called the Wheatsheaf near the Green. On the next morning, Sunday, the day on which he expected his mother's funeral to take place, he set out along the Harrow Road. It was a clear, lovely October morning. The air was sharp and bracing, and the leaves which had taken their autumnal tints were falling from the trees. The road which wound by Westbourne Green gave him a full view of the hill of Hampstead with its church, its crest of houses, and its villas peeping from out the trees. Jack's heart was too full to allow him to derive any pleasure from this scene, so he strolled on without raising his eyes till he arrived at Kensal Green. Here he obtained some breakfast, and mounting the hill turned off into the fields on the right. Crossing them, he ascended an eminence, which from its singular shape seemed to have been the site of a Roman encampment, and which commands a magnificent prospect. Leaning upon a gate, he looked down into the valley. It was the very spot from which his poor mother had gazed after her vain attempt to rescue him at the Mint. But though he was ignorant of this, her image was alone present to him. He beheld the grey tower of Williston Church, embosomed in its grove of trees, now clothed in all the glowing livery of autumn. There was the cottage she had inhabited for so many years. In those fields she had rambled. At that church she had prayed. And he had destroyed all this. But for him she might have been alive and happy. The recollection was too painful, and he burst into an agony of tears. Aroused by the sound of the church bells, he resolved at whatever risk to attend divine service. With this view he descended the hill and presently found a footpath leading to the church. But he was destined to have every tide of feeling awakened, every wound opened. The path he had selected conducted him to his mother's humble dwelling. When she occupied it, it was neatness itself. The little porch was overrun with creepers, the garden trim and exquisitely kept. Now it was a wilderness of weeds. The glass in the windows was broken, the roof unthatched, the walls dilapidated. Jack turned away with an aching heart. It seemed an emblem of the ruin he had caused. As he proceeded, other painful reminiscences were aroused. At every step he seemed to be haunted by the ghost of the past. There was the stile on which Jonathan had sat, and he recollected distinctly the effect of his mocking glance. How it had hardened his heart against his mother's prayer. "Oh God," he exclaimed, "I am severely punished." He had now gained the high road. The villagers were thronging to church. Bounding the corner of a garden wall, he came upon his former place of imprisonment. Some rustic hand had written upon the door, "Jack Sheppard's Cage," and upon the wall was affixed a large placard describing his person and offering a reward for his capture. Muffling up his face, Jack turned away. But he had not proceeded many steps when he heard a man reading aloud an account of his escapes from a newspaper. Hastening to the church, he entered it by the very door near which his first crime had been committed. His mother's screams seemed again to ring in his ears, and he was so deeply affected that, fearful of exciting attention, He was about to quit the sacred edifice when he was stopped by the entrance of Thames, who looked pale as death, with Winifred leaning on his arm. They were followed by Mr. Wood in the deepest mourning. Shrinking involuntarily back into the farthest corner of the seat, Jack buried his face in his hands. The service began. Jack, who had not been in a place of worship for many years, was powerfully affected. Accidentally raising his eyes, he saw that he was perceived by the family from Dollis Hill, and that he was an object of the deepest interest to them. As soon as the service was over, Thames contrived to approach him and whispered, "Be cautious. The funeral will take place after evening service." Jack would not hazard a glance at Winifred, but quitting the church, got into an adjoining meadow and watched the party slowly ascending the road leading to Dollis Hill. At a turn in the road, he perceived Winifred looking anxiously towards him, and when she discovered him, she waved her hand. Returning to the churchyard, he looked round it, and on the western side, near a small yew tree, discovered a new-made grave. "Whose grave is this?" he inquired of a man who was standing near it.
"I can't say," answered the fellow, "but I'll inquire from the sexton, William Morgan. Here, Peter," he added to a curly-headed lad who was playing on one of the grassy tombs, "ask your father to step this way."
The little urchin set off, and presently returned with the sexton.
"It's Mrs. Sheppard's grave, the mother of the famous housebreaker," said Morgan, in answer to Jack's inquiry. "And it's well they let her have Christian burial after all, for they say she destroyed herself for her son. The crowner's quest sat on her yesterday, and if she hadn't been proved out of her mind, she would have been buried at 4 Lane Ends."
Jack could stand no more. Placing a piece of money in Morgan's hands, he hurried out of the churchyard.
"By my soul," said the sexton, "that's as like Jack Sheppard as anyone I have ever seed in my born days."
Hastening to the 6 Bells, Jack ordered some refreshment and engaged a private room, where he remained till the afternoon, absorbed in grief. Meantime, a change had taken place in the weather. The day had become suddenly overcast. The wind blew in fitful gusts and scattered the yellow leaves from the elms and horse-chestnuts. Roused by the bell tolling for evening service, Jack left the house. On reaching the churchyard, he perceived the melancholy procession descending the hill. Just then, a carriage drawn by 4 horses drove furiously up to the 6 Bells. But Jack was too much absorbed to take any notice of it. At this moment the bell began to toll in a peculiar manner, announcing the approach of the corpse. The gate was opened, the coffin brought into the churchyard, and Jack, whose eyes were filled with tears, saw Mr. Wood and Thames pass him, and followed at a foot's pace behind them. Meanwhile, the clergyman, bareheaded and in his surplice, advanced to meet them. Having read the 3 first verses of the impressive service appointed for the burial of the dead, he returned to the church, whither the coffin was carried through the southwestern door, and placed in the center of the aisle, Mr. Wood and Thames taking their places on either side of it, and Jack at a little distance behind. Jack had been touched in the morning, but he was now completely prostrated. In the midst of the holy place which he had formerly profaned lay the body of his unfortunate mother, and he could not help looking upon her untimely end as the retributive vengeance of heaven for the crime he had committed. His grief was so audible that it attracted the notice of some of the bystanders, and Thames was obliged to beg him to control it. In doing this, he chanced to raise his eyes, and half fancied he beheld, shaded by a pillar at the extremity of the western aisle, the horrible countenance of the thief-taker. Before the congregation separated, the clergyman descended from the pulpit, and, followed by the coffin-bearers and mourners, and by Jack at a respectful distance, entered the churchyard. The carriage, which it has been mentioned drove up to the Six Bells, contained 4 persons: Jonathan Wild, his 2 Janissaries, and his porter, Obadiah Lemon. As soon as they had got out, the vehicle was drawn up at the back of a tree near the cage. Having watched the funeral at some distance, Jonathan fancied he could discern the figure of Jack, but not being quite sure, he entered the church. He was daring enough to have seized and carried him off before the whole congregation, but he preferred waiting. Satisfied with his scrutiny, he returned, dispatched Abraham and Obadiah to the northwest corner of the church, placed Quilt behind a buttress near the porch, and sheltered himself behind one of the mighty elms. The funeral procession had now approached the grave, around which many of the congregation, who were deeply interested by the sad ceremonial, had gathered. A slight rain fell at the time, and a few leaves caught by the eddies whirled around. Jonathan mixed with the group, and, sure of his prey, abided his time. The clergyman, meanwhile, proceeded with the service, while the coffin was deposited at the brink of the grave. Just as the attendants were preparing to lower the corpse into the earth, Jack fell on his knees beside the coffin, uttering the wildest exclamations of grief, reproaching himself with the murder of his mother, and invoking the vengeance of heaven on his own head. A murmur ran through the assemblage, by several of whom Jack was recognized. But such was the violence of his grief, such the compunction he exhibited, that all but one looked on with an eye of compassion. That person advanced towards him. "I've killed her!" cried Jack. "You have," rejoined Jonathan, laying a forcible grasp on his shoulder. "You are my prisoner." Jack started to his feet, but before he could defend himself, his right arm was grasped by the Jew who had silently approached him. "Hellhounds!" he cried. "Release me!" At the same moment, Quilt Arnold rushed forward with such haste that, stumbling over William Morgan, he precipitated him into the grave. "Wretch!" cried Jack, "are you not content with the crimes you have committed? But you must carry your villainy to this point. Look at the poor victim at your feet." Jonathan made no reply, but ordered his myrmidons to drag the prisoner along. Thames, meanwhile, had drawn his sword and was about to rush upon Jonathan, but he was withheld by Wood. "Do not shed more blood," cried the carpenter. Groans and hoots were now raised by the crowd, and there was an evident disposition to rescue. A small brickbat was thrown, which struck Jonathan in the face. "You shall not pass," cried several of the crowd. "I knew his poor mother, and for her sake I'll not see this done," cried John Dump. "Slip on the handcuffs," cried the thief-taker, "and now let's see who'll dare to oppose me. I am Jonathan Wild. I have arrested him in the King's name." A deep, indignant groan followed. "Let me see the earth thrown over her," implored Jack, "and take me where you please." "No," thundered Wild. "Allow him that small grace," cried Wood. "No, I tell you," rejoined Jonathan, shouldering his way out of the crowd. "My mother, my poor mother!" exclaimed Jack. But, in spite of his outcries and resistance, he was dragged along by Jonathan and his Janissaries. At the eastern gate of the churchyard stood the carriage with the steps lowered. The mob pursued the thief-taker and his party all the way, and such missiles as could be collected were hurled at them. They even threatened to cut the traces and take off the wheels from the carriage. The Jew got in first. The prisoner was then thrust in by Quilt. Before Jonathan followed, he turned to face his assailants. "Back!" he cried fiercely. "I am an officer in the execution of my duty, and he who opposes me in it shall feel the weight of my hand." He then sprung into the coach, the door of which was closed by Obadiah, who mounted the box. "To Newgate!" cried Jonathan, putting his head out of the window. A deep roar followed this order, and several missiles were launched at the vehicle, which was driven off at a furious pace. and while her son was reconveyed to prison, the body of the unfortunate Mrs. Sheppard was committed to the earth. This ends chapter 26, How Jack Sheppard Attended His Mother's Funeral. Section 53 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 27, How Jack Sheppard Was Brought Back to Newgate. Jack Sheppard's escape from Newgate on the night of the 15th of October was not discovered till the following morning, for although the intelligence was brought by several parties to the lodge in the course of the night, Austin, who was the officer in attendance, paid no attention to them. After pursuing the fugitive as before related, Jonathan Wild returned to his own habitation, where he was occupied during the remainder of the night with Quilt Arnold and Obadiah Lemon in removing everything which, in case of a search, might tend to criminate him. Satisfied in this respect, he flung himself into a chair, for his iron frame seldom required the indulgence of a bed, and sought an hour's repose before he began the villainies of another day. He was aroused from his slumber about 6 o'clock by the return of Abraham Mendez, who, not choosing to confess that Jack had eluded his vigilance, contented himself with stating that he had kept watch till daybreak, when he had carefully searched the field, and, finding no trace of him, had thought it better to return. This information was received by Jonathan with a lowering brow. He comforted himself, however, with the certainty which he felt of capturing his prey on the Sunday. His breakfast dispatched, which he ate with a wolfish appetite, he walked over to Newgate, chuckling as he went at the consternation which his appearance would create amongst the turnkeys. Entering the lodge, the first person he beheld was Austin, who was only just up and whose toilet appeared scarcely completed. A glance satisfied Jonathan that the turnkey was not aware of the prisoner's escape, and he resolved not to destroy what he considered a good jest by a premature disclosure of it.
"You're out betimes this morning, Mr. Wild," observed Austin, as he put on his coat and adjusted his minor bob. "Something fresh on hand, I suppose?"
"I'm come to inquire after Jack Sheppard," returned Jonathan.
"Don't alarm yourself about him, sir," replied Austin. "He's safe enough, I assure you."
"I should like to satisfy myself on that score," rejoined Wild dryly.
"So you shall, sir," replied Austin,
who at this moment recollected, with some uneasiness, the applications at the lodge door during the night.
"I hope you don't imagine anything has gone wrong, sir."
"It matters not what I think," replied Wild. "Come with me to the castle."
"Instantly, sir," replied Austin, "instantly. Here, Caliban, attend to the door and keep the wicket locked till I return, d'ye hear? Now, sir."
Taking the keys, he led the way, followed by Jonathan, who chuckled internally at the shock that awaited the poor fellow. The door was opened, and Austin entered the cell, when he absolutely recoiled before the spectacle he beheld, and could scarcely have looked more alarmed if the prison had tumbled about his ears. Petrified and speechless, he turned an imploring look at Wild, who was himself filled with astonishment at the pile of rubbish lying before him. "'Sdeath!" cried Jonathan, staring at the breach in the wall. "Someone must have assisted him. Unless he has dealings with the devil, he could never have done this alone."
"I firmly believe he has dealings with the devil," replied Austin, trembling from head to foot. "But perhaps he's not got beyond the room above. It's as strong, if not stronger, than this. I'll see."
So saying, he scrambled over the rubbish and got into the chimney. But though the breach was large enough to admit him below, he could not squeeze his bulky person through the aperture into the red room.
"I believe he's gone," he said,
returning to Jonathan. "The door's open and the room empty." "You believe. You know it," replied Jonathan, fixing one of his sternest and most searching glances upon him. "Nothing you can say to the contrary will convince me that you've not been accessory to his flight." "I, sir, I swear—" "Tush!" interrupted Jonathan harshly. "I shall state my suspicions to the governor. Come down with me to the lodge directly. All further examinations must be conducted in the presence of proper witnesses." With these words he strode out of the room, darted down the stone stairs, and on his arrival at the lodge, seized the rope of the great bell communicating with the interior of the prison, which he rang violently. As this was never done, except in some case of great emergency, the application was instantly answered by all the other turnkeys, by Marvel, the 4 partners, and Mrs. Spurling. Nothing could exceed the dismay of these personages when they learnt why they'd been summoned. All seemed infected with Austen's terrors, except Mrs. Spurling, who did not dare to exhibit her satisfaction, otherwise than by privately pinching the arm of her expected husband. Headed by Jonathan, all the turnkeys then repaired to the upper part of the jail, and, approaching the Red Room by a circuitous route, several doors were unlocked, and they came upon the scene of Jack's exploits. Stopping before each door, they took up the plates of the locks, examined the ponderous bolts, and were struck with the utmost astonishment at what they beheld. Arriving at the chapel, their wonder increased. All the jailers declared it utterly impossible he could have accomplished his astonishing task unaided, but who would lend him assistance was a question they were unable to answer. Proceeding to the entry to the lower leads, they came to the 2 strong doors, and their surprise was so great at Jack's marvelous performance that they could scarcely persuade themselves that human ingenuity could have accomplished it. "Here's a door," remarked Ireton, when he got to that nearest the leads, "which I could have sworn would have resisted anything. I've no faith in future in bolts and bars." Mounting the roof of the prison, they traced the fugitive's course to the further extremity of the building, where they found his blanket attached to the spike, proving that he escaped in that direction. After severely examining Austen and finding it proved, on the testimony of his fellow jailers, that he could not have aided Jack in his flight, Jonathan retracted his harsh sentence, and even went so far as to say that he would act as mediator between him and the governor. This was some satisfaction to the poor fellow, who was dreadfully frightened, as indeed he might well be, it being the opinion of the jailers and others who afterwards examined the place, that Jack had accomplished single-handed, in a few hours, and as far as it could be ascertained with imperfect implements, what it would have taken 6 men several days, provided with proper tools, to effect. In their opinion, £100 would not repair the damage done to the prison. As soon as Jack's escape became known, thousands of persons flocked to Newgate to behold his workmanship, and the jailers reaped an abundant harvest from their curiosity. Jonathan, meanwhile, maintained profound secrecy as to his hopes of capturing the fugitive, and when Jack was brought back to Newgate on the Sunday evening, his arrival was wholly unexpected. At a little after 5 on that day, 4 horses dashed round the corner of the Old Bailey and drew up before the door of the lodge. Hearing the stoppage, Austen rushed out, and could scarcely believe his eyes when he beheld Jack Sheppard in the custody of Quilt Arnold and Abraham Mendez. Jack's recapture was speedily made known to all the officers of the jail, and the lodge was instantly crowded. The delight of the turnkeys was beyond all bounds, but poor Mrs. Spurling was in a state of distraction, and began to abuse Jonathan so violently that her future husband was obliged to lay forcible hands upon her and drag her away. By Wilde's command, the prisoner was taken to the condemned hold, whither he was followed by the whole posse of officers and by the partners, 2 of whom carried large hammers and 2 the fetters. There was only one prisoner in the ward. He was chained to the ground, but started up at their approach. It was Blueskin. When he beheld Jack, he uttered a deep groan. "Captain," he cried, in a voice of the bitterest anguish,
Have these dogs again hunted you down? If you hadn't been so unlucky, I should have been with you before tomorrow night." Jack made no answer, nor did he even cast his eyes upon his follower. But Jonathan, fixing a terrible look upon him, cried, "Ha! Say you so? You must be looked to. My lads," he continued, addressing the partners, "when you finish this job, give that fellow a fresh set of darbies. I suspect he's been at work upon those he has on."
"The link of the chain next to the staple is sawn through," said Ireton, stooping to examine Blueskin's fetters.
"Search him and iron him afresh," commanded Jonathan. "But first let us secure Sheppard. We'll then remove them both to the middle stone hold, where a watch shall be kept over them night and day till they're taken to Tyburn. As they're so fond of each other's society, they shan't part company even on that occasion, but shall swing from the same tree." "You'll never live to see that day," cried Blueskin, fixing a menacing look upon him. "What weight are these irons?" asked Jonathan, coolly addressing one of the partners.
"More than 300 weight, sir," replied the man. "They're the heaviest set we have, and were forged expressly for Captain Sheppard."
"They're not half heavy enough," replied Wild. "Let him be handcuffed and doubly ironed on both legs, and when we get him into the stone ward, he shall not only be chained down to the ground, but shall have 2 additional fetters running through the main links, fastened on each side of him. We'll see whether he'll get rid of his new bonds," he added with a brutal laugh, which was echoed by the bystanders.
"Mark me," said Jack sternly. "I have twice broken out of this prison in spite of all your precautions, and were you to load me with thrice the weight of iron you've ordered, you should not prevent my escaping a 3rd time."
"That's right, Captain," cried Blueskin. "We'll give him the slip yet, and hang that butcherly thief-taker upon his own gibbet." "Be silent, dog," cried Jonathan, and with his clenched hand he struck him a violent blow in the face. For the first time, perhaps, in his life, he repented of his brutality. The blow was scarcely dealt when, with a bound like that of a tiger, Blueskin sprang upon him. The chain, which had been partially cut through, snapped near the staple. Before any assistance could be rendered by the jailers, who stood astonished, Blueskin had got Wild in his clutches. His strength has been described as prodigious, but now, heightened by his desire for vengeance, it was irresistible. Jonathan, though a very powerful man, was like an infant in his gripe. Catching hold of his chin, he bent back the neck, while with his left hand he pulled out a clasp knife, which he opened with his teeth, and grasping Wild's head with his arm, notwithstanding his resistance, cut deeply into his throat. The folds of a thick muslin neckcloth in some degree protected him, but the gash was desperate. Blueskin drew the knife across his throat a second time, widening and deepening the wound, and wrenching back the head to get it into a more favorable position. Would infallibly have severed it from the trunk if the officers, who by this time had recovered from their terror, had not thrown themselves upon him and withheld him.
"Now's your time," cried Blueskin, struggling desperately with his assailants and inflicting severe cuts with his knife. "Fly, Captain! Fly!" Aroused to a sense of the possibility of escape, Jack, who had viewed the deadly assault with savage satisfaction, burst from his captors and made for the door. Blueskin fought his way towards it, and exerting all his strength, cutting right and left as he proceeded, reached it at the same time. Jack in all probability would have escaped, if Langley, who was left in the lodge, had not been alarmed at the noise and rushed thither. Seeing Jack at liberty, he instantly seized him, and a struggle commenced. At this moment, Blueskin came up and kept off the officers with his knife. He used his utmost efforts to liberate Jack from Langley, but closely pressed on all sides, he was not able to render any effectual assistance. "Fly!" cried Jack. "Escape if you can. Don't mind me." Casting one look of anguish at his leader, Blueskin then darted down the passage. The only persons in the lodge were Mrs. Spurling and Marvel.
Hearing the noise of the scuffle, Patapstus, fancying it was Jack making an effort to escape in spite of the remonstrances of the executioner, threw open the wicket. Blueskin therefore had nothing to stop him. Dashing through the open door, he crossed the Old Bailey, plunged into a narrow court on the opposite side of the way, and was out of sight in a minute, baffling all pursuit. On their return, the jailers raised up Jonathan, who was weltering in his blood, and who appeared to be dying. Efforts were made to stanch his wounds and surgical assistance sent for. "Has he escaped?" asked the thief-taker faintly.
"Blueskin," said Ireton.
"No."
"Sheppard?"
rejoined Wilde.
No, sir," replied Ireton. "He's here."
"That's right," replied Wilde with a ghastly smile. "Remove him to the middle stone hold. Watch over him night and day. Do you mind?"
"I do, sir."
"Irons, heavy irons, night and day."
"Depend upon it, sir."
"Go with him to Tyburn. Never lose sight of him till the noose is tied." "Where's Marvel?" "Here, sir," replied the executioner. 100 guineas if you hang Jack Sheppard. I have it about me. Take it if I die." "Never fear, sir," replied Marvel. "Oh, that I could live to see it," gasped Jonathan, and with a hideous expression of pain he fainted. "He's dead!" exclaimed Austin.
"I am content," said Jack. "My mother is avenged. Take me to the stone room. Blueskin, you are a true friend."
The body of Jonathan was then conveyed to his own habitation, while Jack was taken to the middle stone room and ironed in the manner Wilde had directed. This ends chapter 27, How Jack Sheppard was brought back to Newgate. Section 54 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 28. What Happened at Dollis Hill. "At length this tragedy is at an end," said Mr. Wood, as having seen the earth thrown over the remains of the unfortunate Mrs. Sheppard, he turned to quit the churchyard. "Let us hope that, like her who loved much, her sins are forgiven her." Without another word, and accompanied by Thames, he then took his way to Dollis Hill in a state of the deepest depression. Thames did not attempt to offer him any consolation, for he was almost as much dejected. The weather harmonized with their feelings. It rained slightly, and a thick mist gathered in the air and obscured the beautiful prospect. On his arrival at Dollis Hill, Mr. Wood was so much exhausted that he was obliged to retire to his own room, where he continued for some hours, overpowered by grief. And their sole discourse turned upon Jack and his ill-fated mother. As the night advanced, Mr. Wood again made his appearance in a more composed frame of mind, and, at his daughter's earnest solicitation, was induced to partake of some refreshment. An hour was then passed in conversation as to the possibility of rendering any assistance to Jack in deploring his unhappy destiny, and in the consideration of the course to be pursued in reference to Jonathan Wilde. While they were thus occupied, a maidservant entered the room and stated that a person was without who had a packet for Captain Darrell, which must be delivered into his own hands. Notwithstanding the remonstrances of Wood and Winifred, Thames instantly followed the domestic and found a man with his face muffled up at the door, as she had described. Somewhat alarmed at his appearance, Thames laid his hand upon his sword. "Fear nothing, sir," said the man, in a voice which Thames instantly recognized as that of Blueskin. "I'm come to render you a service. There are the packets which my captain hazarded his life to procure for you, and which he said would establish your right to the estates of a Trenchard family. There are also the letters which were scattered about Wilde's room after the murder of Sir Rowland. And there," he added, placing in his hands a heavy bag of money and a pocket-book, "is a sum little short of £15,000. "How have you procured these things?" asked Thames, in the utmost astonishment. "I carried them off on the fatal night when we got into Wilde's house, and you were struck down," replied Blueskin. "They have ever since been deposited in a place of safety. You have nothing more to fear from Wilde." "How so?" asked Thames. "I've saved the executioner a labour by cutting his throat," replied Blueskin. "And may I be cursed if I ever did anything in my whole life which gave me so much satisfaction." "Almighty God! Is this possible?" exclaimed Thames. "You will find it true," replied Blueskin. "All I regret is that I failed in liberating the captain. If he had got off, they might have hanged me and welcome." "What can be done for him?" cried Thames. "That's not an easy question to answer," rejoined Blueskin. "But I shall watch night and day about Newgate in the hope of getting him out. He wouldn't require my aid, but before I stopped Jonathan's mouth, he had ordered him to be doubly ironed and constantly watched. And though the villain can't see his orders executed, I've no doubt someone else will." "Poor Jack!" exclaimed Thames. "I would sacrifice all my fortune, all my hopes, to liberate him." "If you're in earnest," rejoined Blueskin, "give me that bag of gold. It contains £1,000, and if all other schemes fail, I'll engage to free him on the way to Tyburn." "May I trust you?" hesitated Thames. "Why did I not keep the money when I had it?" returned Blueskin angrily. "Not a farthing of it shall be expended except in the captain's service." "Take it," replied Thames. "You have saved his life," replied Blueskin. "And now, mark me, you owe what I have done for you to him, not to me. Had I not known that you and your affianced bride are dearer to him than life, I should have used this money to secure my own safety. Take it, and take the estates in Captain Sheppard's name. Promise me one thing before I leave you." "What is it?" asked Thames. "If the captain is taken to Tyburn, be near the place of execution, at the end of the Edgware Road." "I will." "In case of need, you will lend a helping hand?" "Yes, yes." "Swear it." "I do." "Enough," rejoined Blueskin. And he departed just as Wood, who had become alarmed by Thames' long absence, made his appearance with a blunderbuss in his hand. Hastily acquainting him with the treasures he had unexpectedly obtained, Thames returned to the room to apprise Winifred of his good fortune. The packets were hastily broken open, and, while Wood was absorbed in the perusal of the despatch addressed to him by Sir Rowland, Thames sought out and found the letter which he had been prevented from finishing on the fatal night at Jonathan Wilde's. As soon as he'd read it, he let it fall from his grasp. Winifred instantly picked it up. "You are no longer Thames Darrell," she said, casting her eyes rapidly over it, "but the Marquis de Chatillon." "My father was of the blood royal of France," exclaimed Thames. "Eh, what's this?" cried Wood, looking up from beneath his spectacles. Who is this Marquis de Chatillon?" "Your adopted son, Thames Darrell," answered Winifred. "And the Marchioness is your daughter," added Thames. "Oh, Lord!" ejaculated Wood. "My head fairly turns round. So many distresses, so many joys coming at the same time are too much for me. Read that letter, Thames. My Lord Marquis, I mean. Read it,
and you'll find that your unfortunate uncle Sir Rowland surrenders to you all the estates in Lancashire. You've nothing to do but to take possession." "What a strange history is mine," said Thames. "Kidnapped and sent to France by one uncle, it was my lot to fall into the hands of another, my father's own brother, the Marshal Gaucher de Chatillon, to whom and to the Cardinal Dubois I owed all my good fortune." "The ways of Providence are inscrutable," observed Wood. "When in France, I heard from the Marshal that his brother had perished in London on the night of the great storm. It was supposed he was drowned in crossing the river, as his body had never been found. Little did I imagine at the time that it was my own father to whom he referred." "I think I remember reading something about your father in the papers," observed Wood. "Wasn't he in some way connected with the Jacobite plots?" "He was," replied Thames. "He'd been many years in this country before his assassination took place. In this letter, which is addressed to my ill-fated mother, he speaks of his friendship for Sir Rowland, whom it seems he had known abroad, but entreats her to keep the marriage secret for a time, for reasons which are not fully developed." "And so Sir Rowland murdered his friend," remarked Wood. "Crime upon crime." "Unconsciously, perhaps," replied Thames. "But be it as it may, he's now beyond the reach of earthly punishment." "But Wilde still lives," cried Wood. "He also has paid the penalty of his offences," returned Thames. "He has fallen by the hand of Blueskin, who brought me these packets." "Thank God for that," cried Wood heartily. "I could almost forgive the wretch the injury he did me in depriving me of my poor dear wife. No, not quite that," he added, a little confused. "And now," said Thames, for we must still preserve the name, "you will no longer defer my happiness?" "Hold!" interposed Winifred gravely. "I release you from your promise. A carpenter's daughter is no fit match for a peer of France." "If my dignity must be purchased by the loss of you, I renounce it," cried Thames. "You will not make it valueless in my eyes," he added, catching her in his arms and pressing her to his breast. "Be it as you please," replied Winifred. "My lips would belie my heart were I to refuse you." "And now, father, your blessing, your consent," cried Thames. "You have both," replied Wood fervently. "I am too much honoured, too happy in the union. Oh, that I should live to be father-in-law to a peer of France! What would my poor wife say to it if she could come to life again? Oh, Thames, my Lord Marquis, I mean, you've made me the happiest, the proudest of mankind." Not many days after this event, on a bright October morning, the bells rang a merry peal from the old grey tower of Williston Church. All the village was assembled in the churchyard. Young and old were dressed in their gayest apparel, and it was evident from the smiles that lighted up every countenance, from the roguish looks of the younger swains, and the demure expressions of several pretty rustic maidens, that a ceremony, which never fails to interest all classes, a wedding, was about to take place. At the gate opening upon the road leading to Dollis Hill were stationed William Morgan and John Dump. Presently, 2 carriages dashed down the hill and drew up before it. From the first of these alighted Thames, or, as he must now be styled, the Marquis de Chatillon. From the second descended Mr. Wood, and after him came his daughter. The sun never shone upon a lovelier couple than now approached the altar. The church was crowded to excess by the numbers eager to witness the ceremony, and as soon as it was over, the wedded pair were followed to the carriage, and the loudest benedictions uttered for their happiness. In spite of the tumultuous joy which agitated him, the bridegroom could not prevent the intrusion of some saddening thoughts, as he reflected upon the melancholy scene which he had so recently witnessed in the same place. The youthful couple had been seated in the carriage a few minutes when they were joined by Mr. Wood, who had merely absented himself to see that a public breakfast, which he had ordered at the Six Bells for all who chose to partake of it, was in readiness. He likewise gave directions that in the after part of the day a whole bullock should be roasted on the green and distributed, together with a barrel of the strongest ale. In the evening a band of village musicians, accompanied by most of the young inhabitants of Williston, strolled out to Dollis Hill, where they formed a rustic concert under the great elm before the door. Here they were regaled with another plentiful meal by the hospitable carpenter, who personally superintended the repast. These festivities, however, were not witnessed by the newly married pair, who had departed immediately after the ceremony for Manchester. This ends chapter 28, What Happened at Dollis Hill.
Section 55 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 29, How Jack Sheppard was taken to Westminster Hall. Loaded with the heaviest fetters and constantly watched by two of the jailer's assistants, who neither quitted him for a single moment nor suffered any visitor to approach him, Jack Sheppard found all attempts to escape impracticable. He was confined in the Middle Stone Ward, a spacious apartment, with good light and air, situated over the gateway on the western side, and allotted to him, not for his own convenience, but for that of the keepers, who, if he had been placed in a gloomier or more incommodious dungeon, would have necessarily had to share it with him. Through this, his last trial, Jack's spirits never deserted him. He seemed resigned but cheerful, and held frequent and serious discourses with the ordinary, who felt satisfied of his sincere penitence. The only circumstance which served to awaken a darker feeling in his breast was that his implacable foe Jonathan Wild had survived the wound inflicted by Blueskin, and was slowly recovering. As soon as he could be moved with safety, Jonathan had himself transported to Newgate, where he was carried into the middle ward, that he might feast his eyes upon his victim. Having seen every precaution taken to ensure his safe custody, he departed, muttering to himself, "I shall yet live to see him hanged. I shall live to see him hanged." Animated by his insatiate desire of vengeance, he seemed to gain strength daily, so much so that within a fortnight after receiving his wound he was able to stir abroad. On Thursday, the 12th of November, after having endured nearly a month's imprisonment, Jack Sheppard was conveyed from Newgate to Westminster Hall. He was placed in a coach, handcuffed and heavily fettered, and guarded by a vast posse of officers to Temple Bar, where a fresh relay of constables escorted him to Westminster. By this time, Jack's reputation had risen to such a height with the populace, his exploits having become the universal theme of discourse, but the streets were almost impassable for the crowds collected to obtain a view of him. The vast area in front of Westminster Hall was thronged with people, and it was only by a vigorous application of their staves that the constables could force a passage for the vehicle. At length, however, the prisoner was got out, when such was the rush of the multitude that several persons were trampled down and received severe injuries. Arrived in the hall, the prisoner's handcuffs were removed, and he was taken before the Court of King's Bench. The record of his conviction at the Old Bailey sessions was then read, and as no objection was offered to it, the Attorney General moved that his execution might take place on Monday next. Upon this, Jack earnestly and eloquently addressed himself to the bench, and besought that a petition which he had prepared to be laid before the king might be read. This request, however, was refused, and he was told that the only way in which he could entitle himself to his Majesty's clemency would be by discovering who had abetted him in his last escape, the strongest suspicions being entertained that he had not effected it alone. Sheppard replied by a solemn assertion that he had received no assistance except from heaven, an answer for which he was immediately reprimanded by the court. It having been stated that it was wholly impossible he could have removed his irons in the way he represented, he offered, if his handcuffs were replaced, to take them off in the presence of the court. The proposal, however, was not acceded to, and the Chief Justice Powys, after enumerating his various offences and commenting upon their heinousness, awarded sentence of death against him for the following Monday. As Jack was removed, he noticed Jonathan Wild at a little distance from him, eyeing him with a look of the most savage satisfaction. The thief-taker's throat was bound up with thick folds of linen, and his face had a ghastly and cadaverous look, which communicated an undefinable and horrible expression to his glances. Meanwhile, the mob outside had prodigiously increased, and had begun to exhibit some disposition to riot. The coach in which the prisoner had been conveyed was already broken to pieces, and the driver was glad to escape with life. Terrific shouts were raised by the rabble, who threatened to tear Wild in pieces if he showed himself. Amid this tumult, several men armed with tremendous bludgeons, with their faces besmeared with grease and soot and otherwise disguised, were observed to be urging the populace to attempt a rescue. They were headed by an athletic-looking, swarthy-featured man, who was armed with a cutlass, which he waved over his head to cheer on his companions. These desperadoes had been the most active in demolishing the coach, and now, being supported by the rabble, they audaciously approached the very portals of the ancient hall. The shouts, yells, and groans which they uttered, and which were echoed by the concourse in the rear, were perfectly frightful. Jonathan, who with the other constables had reconnoitred this band, and recognized in its ringleader Blueskin, commanded the constables to follow him, and made a sally for the purpose of seizing him. Enfeebled by his wound, Wild had lost much of his strength, though nothing of his ferocity and energy, and fiercely assailing Blueskin, he made a desperate but unsuccessful attempt to apprehend him. He was, however, instantly beaten back, and the fury of the mob was so great that it was with difficulty he could effect a retreat. The whole force of the constables, jailers, and others was required to keep the crowd out of the hall. The doors were closed and barricaded, and the mob threatened to burst them open if Jack was not delivered to them. Things now began to wear so serious an aspect that a messenger was secretly dispatched to the Savoy for troops, and in half an hour a regiment of the guards arrived, who by dint of great exertions succeeded in partially dispersing the tumultuous assemblage. Another coach was then procured, in which the prisoner was placed. Jack's appearance was hailed with the loudest cheers, but when Jonathan followed and took a place beside him in the vehicle, determined, he said, never to lose sight of him, the abhorrence of the multitude was expressed by execrations, hoots, and yells of the most terrific kind. So dreadful were these shouts as to produce an effect upon the hardened feelings of Jonathan, who shrank out of sight. It was well for him that he had taken his place by Sheppard, as regard for the latter alone prevented the deadliest missiles being hurled at him. As it was, the mob went on alternately hooting and huzzahing as the names of Wild and Sheppard were pronounced, while some individuals, bolder than the rest, thrust their faces into the coach window, and assured Jack that he should never be taken to Tyburn. "We'll see that, you yelping hounds," rejoined Jonathan, glaring fiercely at them. In this way, Jack was brought back to Newgate, and again chained down in the middle ward. It was late before Jonathan ventured to his own house, where he remained up all night and kept his Janissaries and other assistants well armed. This ends chapter 29, how Jack Sheppard was taken to Westminster Hall. Section 56 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance, by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 30. How Jonathan Wild's house was burnt down. The day appointed for the execution was now close at hand, and the prisoner, who seemed to have abandoned all hopes of escape, turned his thoughts entirely from worldly considerations. On Sunday he was conveyed to the chapel, through which he had passed on the occasion of his great escape, and once more took a seat in the condemned pew. The Reverend Mr. Peine, the ordinary, who had latterly conceived a great regard for Jack, addressed him in a discourse which, while it tended to keep alive his feelings of penitence, was calculated to afford him much consolation. The chapel was crowded to excess, but here, even here, the demon was suffered to intrude, and Jack's thoughts were distracted by Jonathan Wild, who stood at a little distance from him and kept his bloodthirsty eyes fixed on him during the whole of the service. On that night, an extraordinary event occurred, which convinced the authorities that every precaution must be taken in conducting Jack to Tyburn, a fact of which they had been previously made aware, though scarcely to the same extent, by the riotous proceedings near Westminster Hall. About 9 o'clock, an immense mob collected before the lodge at Newgate. It was quite dark, but as some of the assemblage carried links, it was soon ascertained to be headed by the same party who had mainly incited the former disturbance. Amongst the ringleaders was Blueskin, whose swarthy features and athletic figure were easily distinguished. Another was Baptist Kettleby, and a third, in a Dutch dress, was recognized by his grizzled beard as the skipper, Van Galgebrock. Before an hour had elapsed, the concourse was fearfully increased. The area in front of the jail was completely filled. Attempts were made upon the door of the lodge, but it was too strong to be forced. A cry was then raised by the leaders to attack Wild's house, and the fury of the mob was instantly directed to that quarter. Wrenched from their holds, the iron palisades in front of the thief-taker's dwelling were used as weapons to burst open the door. While this was passing, Jonathan opened one of the upper windows and fired several shots upon the assailants. But though he made Blueskin and Kettleby his chief marks, he missed both. The sight of the thief-taker increased the fury of the mob to a fearful degree. Terrific yells rent the air. The heavy weapon thundered against the door, and it speedily yielded to their efforts. "Come on, my lads," vociferated Blueskin. "We'll unkennel the old fox." As he spoke, several shots were fired from the upper part of the house, and 2 men fell mortally wounded. But this only incensed the assailing party the more. With a drawn cutlass in one hand and a cocked pistol in the other, Blueskin rushed upstairs. The landing was defended by Quilt Arnold and the Jew. The former was shot by Blueskin through the head, and his body fell over the banisters. The Jew, who was paralyzed by his companion's fate, offered no resistance and was instantly seized. "Where is your cursed master?" demanded Blueskin, holding the sword to his throat. The Jew did not speak, but pointed to the audience chamber. Committing him to the custody of the others, Blueskin, followed by a numerous band, darted in that direction. The door was locked, but with the bars of iron it was speedily burst open. Several of the assailants carried links, so that the room was a blaze of light. Jonathan, however, was nowhere to be seen. Rushing towards the entrance of the well-hole, Blueskin touched the secret spring. He was not there. Opening the trap-door, he then descended to the vaults, searched each cell and every nook and corner separately. Wild had escaped. Robbed of their prey, the fury of the mob became ungovernable. At length, at the end of a passage next to the cell where Mrs. Sheppard had been confined, Blueskin discovered a trap-door which he had not previously noticed. It was instantly burst open when the horrible stench that issued from it convinced them that it must be a receptacle for the murdered victims of the thief-taker. Holding a link into the place, which had the appearance of a deep pit, Blueskin noticed the body richly dressed. He dragged it out, and perceiving, in spite of the decayed frame, that it was the body of Sir Rowland Trenchard, commanded his attendants to convey it upstairs, an order which was promptly obeyed. Returning to the audience chamber, Blueskin had the Jew brought before him.
The body of Sir Rowland was then laid on the large table. Opposite to it was placed the Jew. Seeing from the threatening looks of his captors that they were about to wreak their vengeance upon him, the miserable wretch besought mercy in abject terms, and charged his master with the most atrocious crimes. His relation to the murder of Sir Rowland petrified even his fierce auditors. One of the cases in Jonathan's museum was now burst open, and a rope taken from it. In spite of his shrieks, the miserable Jew was then dragged into the well-hole, and the rope being tied round his neck, he was launched from the bridge. The vengeance of the assailants did not stop here. They broke open the entrance into Jonathan's storeroom, plundered it of everything valuable, ransacked every closet, drawer, and secret hiding place, and stripped them of their contents. Large hoards of money were discovered, gold and silver plate, cases of watches, and various precious articles. Nothing, in short, portable or valuable was left. Old implements of housebreaking were discovered, and the thief-taker's most hidden depositories were laid bare. The work of plunder over, that of destruction commenced. Straw and other combustibles being collected were placed in the middle of the audience chamber. On these were thrown all the horrible contents of Jonathan's museum, together with the body of Sir Rowland Trenchard. The whole was then fired, and in a few minutes the room was ablaze. Not content with this, the assailants set fire to the house in half a dozen other places, and the progress of the flames was rapid and destructive. Meanwhile, the object of all this fearful disturbance had made his escape to Newgate, from the roof of which he witnessed the destruction of his premises. He saw the flames burst from the windows, and perhaps in that maddening spectacle suffered torture equivalent to some of the crimes he had committed. While he was thus standing, the flames of his house, which made the whole street as light as day and ruddily illumined the faces of the mob below, betrayed him to them, and he was speedily driven from his position by a shower of stones and other missiles. The mob now directed their attention to Newgate, and from their threats appeared determined to fire it. Ladders, pavers' rams, sledge-hammers, and other destructive implements were procured, and in all probability their purpose would have been effected, but for the opportune arrival of a detachment of the guards, who dispersed them, not without some loss of life. Several prisoners were taken, but the ringleaders escaped. Ensigns were brought to play upon Wilde's premises and upon the adjoining houses. The latter were saved, but of the former nothing but the blackened stoned walls were found standing on the morrow. This ends chapter 30, How Jonathan Wild's House Was Burnt Down.
Section 57 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 31. The Procession to Tyburn. The noise of this disturbance did not fail to reach the interior of the prison. In fact, the reflection of the flames lighted up the ward in which Jack Sheppard was confined. The night of his execution was therefore passed in a most anxious state of mind, nor was his uneasiness allayed by the appearance of Jonathan Wild, who, after he had been driven from the roof of the jail, repaired to the middle stone ward in a fit of ungovernable passion, to vent his rage upon the prisoner, whom he looked upon as the cause of the present calamity. Such was his fury, that if he had not been restrained by the presence of the two turnkeys, he might perhaps have anticipated the course of justice by laying violent hands upon his victim. After venting his wrath in the wildest manner, and uttering the most dreadful execrations, Jonathan retired to another part of the prison, where he passed the night in consultation with the governor as to the best means of conveying the prisoner securely to Tyburn. Mr. Pitt endeavored to dissuade him from attending in person, representing the great risk he would incur from the mob, which was certain to be assembled. But Jonathan was not to be deterred. "I've sworn to see him hanged," he said, "and nothing shall keep me away. Nothing by—" By Wilde's advice, the usual constabulary force was greatly augmented. Messengers were dispatched to all the constables and head boroughs to be in attendance, to the sheriffs to have an extraordinary number of their officers in attendance, and to the Savoy to obtain the escort of a troop of grenadier guards. In short, more preparations were made than if a state criminal was about to be executed. The morning of Monday, the 16th of November, 1724, at length dawned. It was a dull, foggy day, and the atmosphere was so thick and heavy that at 8 o'clock the curious who arrived near the prison could scarcely discern the tower of St. Sepulchre's church. By and by the tramp of horses' feet was heard slowly ascending Snow Hill, and presently a troop of grenadier guards rode into the area facing Newgate. These were presently joined by a regiment of foot. A large body of the constables of Westminster next made their appearance, the chief of whom entered the lodge, where they were speedily joined by the civic authorities. At 9 o'clock the sheriffs arrived, followed by their officers and javelin men. Meantime, the stone hall was crowded by all the inmates of the jail, debtors, felons, turnkeys, and officers who could obtain permission to witness the ceremony of the prisoner's irons being struck off. Caliban, who, through the interest of Mr. Ireton, was appointed to the office, stood with a hammer in one hand and a punch in the other, near the great stone block, ready to fulfill his duty. Close behind him stood the tall, gaunt figure of Marvel, with his large bony hands, his scraggy neck, and ill-favoured countenance. Next to the executioner stood his wife, the former Mrs. Spurling. Mrs. Marvel held her handkerchief to her eyes and appeared in great distress. But her husband, whose deportment to her was considerably changed since the fatal knot had been tied, paid no attention whatever to her grief. At this moment the bell of Newgate began to toll, and was answered by another bell from St. Sepulchre's. The great door of the stone hall was thrown open, and the sheriffs, preceded by the javelin men, entered the room. They were followed by Jonathan, who carried a stout stick under his arm, and planted himself near the stone. Not a word was uttered by the assemblage, but a hush of expectation reigned throughout. Another door was next opened, and, preceded by the ordinary, with the sacred volume in his hand, the prisoner entered the room. Though encumbered by his irons, his step was firm, and his demeanour dignified. His countenance was pale as death, but not a muscle quivered, nor did he betray the slightest appearance of fear. On the contrary, it was impossible to look at him without perceiving that his resolution was unshaken. Advancing with a slow, firm step to the stone block, he placed his left foot upon it, drew himself up to his full height, and fixed a look so stern upon Jonathan that the thief-taker quailed before it. The black, meantime, began to ply his hammer, and speedily unriveted the chains. The first stroke appeared to arouse all the vindictive passions of Jonathan. Fixing a ferocious and exulting look upon Jack Sheppard, he exclaimed, "At length my vengeance is complete." "Wretch!" cried Jack, raising his hand in a menacing manner, "your triumph will be short-lived. Before a year has expired, you will share the same fate." "If I do, I care not," rejoined Wilde. "I shall have lived to see you hanged." "Oh, Jack, dear, dear Jack," cried Mrs. Marvel, who was now quite dissolved in tears. "I shall never survive this scene." "Hold your tongue, hussy," cried her husband gruffly. "Women ought never to show themselves on these occasions, unless they can behave themselves properly." "Farewell, Jack," cried 20 voices. Sheppard looked round and exchanged kindly glances with several of those who addressed him. "My limbs feel so light, now that my irons are removed," he observed with a smile, "that I'm half inclined to dance." "You'll dance upon nothing presently," rejoined Jonathan brutally. "Farewell forever," said Jack, extending his hand to Mrs. Marvel. "Farewell," blubbered the executioner's wife, pressing his hand to her lips. Here are a pair of gloves and a nosegay for you. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Be careful of him," she added to her husband, "and get it over quickly, or never expect to see me again."
"Peace, fool!" cried Marvel angrily. "Do you think I don't know my own business?"
Austen and Langley then advanced to the prisoner and, twining their arms around his, led him down to the lodge, whither he was followed by the sheriffs, the ordinary, Wilde, and the other officials. Meantime, every preparation had been made outside for his departure. At the end of 2 long lines of foot guards stood the cart with a powerful black horse harnessed to it. At the head of the cart was placed the coffin. On the right were several mounted grenadiers. On the left, some half-dozen javelin men. Soldiers were stationed at different points of the street to keep off the mob, and others were riding backwards and forwards to maintain an open space for the passage of the procession. The assemblage which was gathered together was almost countless. Every housetop, every window, every wall, every projection had its occupants. The wall of St. Sepulchre's Church was covered. So was the tower. The concourse extended along Giltsport Street as far as Smithfield. No one was allowed to pass along Newgate Street, which was barricaded and protected by a strong constabulary force. The first person who issued from the lodge was Mr. Marvel, who proceeded to the cart and took his seat upon the coffin. The hangman is always an object of peculiar detestation to the mob. A tremendous hooting hailed his appearance, and both staves and swords were required to preserve order. A deep silence, however, now prevailed, broken only by the tolling of the bells of Newgate and St. Sepulchre's. The mighty concourse became for a moment still. Suddenly, such a shout as has seldom smitten human ears rent the air. "He comes!" cried 1,000 voices, and the shout ascended to Smithfield, descended to Snow Hill, and told those who were assembled on Holborn Hill that Sheppard had left the prison. Between the 2 officers, with their arms linked in his, Jack Sheppard was conducted to the cart. He looked around, and as he heard that deafening shout, as he felt the influence of those 1,000 eyes fixed upon him, as he listened to the cheers, all his misgivings, if he had any, vanished, and he felt more as if he were marching to a triumph than proceeding to a shameful death. Jack had no sooner taken his place in the cart than he was followed by the ordinary, who seated himself beside him, and, opening the book of prayer, began to read aloud. Excited by the scene, Jack, however, could pay little attention to the good man's discourse, and was lost in a whirl of tumultuous emotions. The cavalcade was now put slowly in motion. The horse soldiers wheeled round and cleared a path. The foot closed in upon the cart. Then came the javelin men, walking 4 abreast, and lastly a long line of constables marching in the same order. The procession had just got into line of march when a dreadful groan, mixed with yells, hootings, and execrations, was heard. This was occasioned by Jonathan Wild, who was seen to mount his horse and join the train. Jonathan, however, paid no sort of attention to this demonstration of hatred. He buckled on his hanger and had 2 brace of pistols in his belt, as well as others in his holsters. By this time the procession had reached the west end of the wall of St. Sepulchre's Church, where, in compliance with an old custom, it halted. By the will of Mr. Robert Dow, merchant tailor, it was appointed that the sexton of St. Sepulchre's should pronounce a solemn exhortation upon every criminal on his way to Tyburn, for which office he was to receive a small stipend. As soon as the cavalcade stopped, the sexton advanced, and, ringing a handbell, pronounced the following admonition: "All good people pray heartily unto God for this poor sinner, who is now going to take his death, for whom this great bell doth toll. You who are condemned to die, repent with lamentable tears. Ask mercy of the Lord for the salvation of your own soul through the merit of the death and passion of Jesus Christ, who now sits at the right hand of God to make intercession for you if you penitently return to him. The Lord have mercy upon you." This ceremony concluded, the cavalcade was again put in motion. Slowly descending Snow Hill, the train passed on its way, attended by the same stunning vociferations, cheers, yells, and outcries which had accompanied it on starting from Newgate. The guards had great difficulty in preserving a clear passage without resorting to severe measures, for the tide, which poured upon them behind, around, in front, and at all sides, was almost irresistible. The houses on Snow Hill were thronged like those in Old Bailey. Every window, from the ground floor to the garret, had its occupant, and the roofs were covered with spectators. Words of encouragement and sympathy were addressed to Jack, who, as he looked around, beheld many a friendly glance fixed upon him. In this way they reached Holborn Bridge. Here a little delay occurred. The passage was so narrow that there was only sufficient room for the cart to pass, with a single line of foot soldiers on one side, and as the walls of the bridge were covered with spectators, it was not deemed prudent to cross it till these persons were dislodged. While this was effected, intelligence was brought that a formidable mob was pouring down Field Lane, the end of which was barricaded. The advanced guard rode on to drive away any opposition, while the main body of the procession crossed the bridge and slowly toiled up Holborn Hill. The entrance of Shoe Lane and the whole line of the wall of St. Andrew's Church, the bell of which was tolling, was covered with spectators. Upon the steps leading to the gates of a church stood two persons whom Jack instantly recognized. These were his mistresses, Poll Maggot and Edgeworth Bess. As soon as the latter beheld him, she uttered a loud scream and fainted.
She was caught by some of the bystanders, who offered her every assistance.
As to Mrs. Maggot, whose nerves were more firmly strung, she contented herself with waving her hand affectionately to her lover, and encouraging him by her gestures. While this was taking place, another and more serious interruption occurred. The advanced guard had endeavored to disperse the mob in Field Lane, but were not prepared to meet with the resistance they encountered. The pavement had been hastily picked up and heaped across the end of the street, upon which planks, barrels, and other barricades were laid. Most of the mob were armed with picks, staves, swords, muskets, and other weapons, and offered a most desperate resistance to the soldiery, whom they drove back with a shower of paving stones. The arrival of the cart at the end of Field Lane appeared the signal for an attempt at rescue. With a loud shout, and headed by a powerfully built man with a face as black as that of a mulatto, and armed with a cutlass, the rabble leapt over the barricades and rushed towards the vehicle. An immediate halt took place. The soldiers surrounded the cart, drew their swords, and by striking the rioters first with the blunt edge of their blades and afterwards with the sharp points, succeeded in driving them back. Amid this skirmish Jonathan greatly distinguished himself. Drawing his hanger, he rode amongst the crowd, trampled upon those most in advance, and made an attempt to seize their leader, in whom he recognized Blueskin. Baffled in their attempt, the mob uttered a roar such as only 1,000 angry voices can utter, and discharged a volley of missiles at the soldiery. Stones and brickbats were showered on all sides, and Mr. Marvel was almost dislodged from his seat on the coffin by a dead dog, which was hurled against him and struck him in the face. At length, however, by dealing blows right and left with their swords, and even inflicting severe cuts on the foremost of the rabble, the soldiers managed to gain a clear course and to drive back the assailants, who, as they retreated behind the barricades, shouted in tones of defiance, "To Tyburn! To Tyburn!" The object of all this tumult, meanwhile, never altered his position, but sat back in the cart, as if resolved not to make even a struggle to regain his liberty. The procession now wound its way without further interruption along Holborn. Like a river swollen by many currents, it gathered force from the various avenues that poured their streams into it. Fetter Lane on the left,
Gray's Inn on the right added their supplies. On all hands Jack was cheered, and Jonathan hooted. At length the train approached St. Giles. Here, according to another old custom already alluded to, a criminal taken to execution was allowed to halt at a tavern called the Crown and take a draught from St. Giles' bowl as his last refreshment on earth. At the door of this tavern, which was situated on the left of the street, not more than 100 yards distant from the church, the bell of which began to toll as soon as the procession came in sight, the cart drew up and the whole cavalcade halted. A wooden balcony in one of the adjoining houses was thronged with ladies, all of whom appeared to take a lively interest in the scene, and to be full of commiseration for the criminal, not perhaps unmixed with admiration of his appearance. Every window in the public house was filled with guests, and, as in the case of St. Andrew's, the churchyard wall of St. Giles was lined with spectators. A scene now ensued, highly characteristic of the age and the occasion. The doleful procession at once assumed a festive character. Many of the soldiers dismounted and called for drink. Their example was immediately imitated by the officers, constables, javelin men, and other attendants, and nothing was to be heard but shouts of laughter and jesting. Nothing seen but the passing of glasses and the emptying of foaming jugs. Mr. Marvel, who had been a little discomposed by the treatment he had experienced on Holborn Hill, very composedly filled and lighted his pipe. One group at the door attracted Jack's attention, inasmuch as it was composed of several of his old acquaintances, Mr. Kneebone, Van Galgerbrock, and Baptist Kettleby, all of whom greeted him cordially. Besides these, there was a sturdy-looking fellow, whom he instantly recognized as the honest blacksmith who had freed him from his irons at Tottenham.
"I'm here, you see," said the smith.
"So I perceive," replied Jack. At this moment the landlord of the Crown, a jovial-looking stout personage with a white apron round his waist, issued from the house, bearing a large wooden bowl filled with ale, which he offered to Jack, who instantly rose to receive it. Raising the bowl in his right hand, Jack glanced towards the balcony in which the group of ladies were seated, and begged to drink their healths. He then turned to Kneebone and the others, who extended their hands towards him, and raised it to his lips. Just as he was about to drain it, he encountered the basilisk glance of Jonathan Wild, and paused. "I leave this bowl for you," he cried, returning it to the landlord untasted. "Your father said so before you," replied Jonathan malignantly, "and yet it has tarried thus long." "You will call for it before 6 months are past," rejoined Jack sternly. Once again the cavalcade was in motion, and winding its way by St. Giles' Church, the bell of which continued tolling all the time, passed the Pound and entered Oxford Road, or as it was then not unfrequently termed, Tyburn Road. After passing Tottenham Court Road, very few houses were to be seen on the right hand. Opposite Water Street it was open country. The crowd now dispersed amongst the fields, and thousands of persons were seen hurrying towards Tyburn as fast as their legs could carry them, leaping over hedges and breaking down every impediment in their course. Besides those who conducted themselves more peaceably, the conductors of the procession noticed with considerable uneasiness large bands of men armed with staves, bludgeons, and other weapons, who were flying across the field in the same direction. As it was feared that some mischief would ensue, Wild volunteered, if he were allowed a small body of men, to ride forward to Tyburn and keep the ground clear until the arrival of the prisoner. This suggestion being approved, was instantly acted upon, and the thief-taker, accompanied by a body of the grenadiers, rode forward. The train meantime had passed Marylebone Lane, when it again paused for a moment at Jack's request, near the door of a public house called the City of Oxford. Scarcely had it come to halt, when a stalwart man shouldered his way, in spite of their opposition, through the lines of soldiery to the cart, and offered his large horny hand to the prisoner. "I told you I'd call to bid you farewell, Mr. Figg," said Jack. "So you did," replied the prize fighter. "Sorry you're obliged to keep your word. Heard of your last escape. Hoped you'd not be retaken. Never sent for the shirt."
"I didn't want it," replied Jack. "But who are those gentlemen?"
"Friends of yours," replied Fig, "come to see you. Sir James Thornhill, Mr. Hogarth, and Mr. Gay. They send you every good wish."
"Offer them my hearty thanks," replied Jack, waving his hand to the group, all of whom returned the salutation. "And now, farewell, Mr. Fig. In a few minutes, all will be over." Fig turned aside to hide the tears that started to his eyes. For the stout prize fighter, with a man's courage, had a woman's heart. And the procession again set forward. This ends chapter 31, The Procession to Tyburn. Section 58 of Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 32, The Closing Scene. Tyburn was now at hand. Over the sea of heads arose a black and dismal object. It was the gallows. Jack, whose back was towards it, did not see it, but he heard from the pitying exclamations of the crowd that it was in view. This circumstance produced no further alteration in his demeanor, except that he endeavored to abstract himself from the surrounding scene and bend his attention to the prayers which the ordinary was reciting. Just as he had succeeded in fixing his attention, it was again shaken, and he was almost unnerved by the sight of Mr. Wood, who was standing at the edge of a raised platform, anxiously waving his hand to him. Jack instantly sprang to his feet, and as his guards construed the motion into an attempt to escape, several of them drew their swords and motioned to him to sit down. But Jack did not heed them. His looks were fixed on his old benefactor. "God in heaven bless you, unhappy boy!" cried Wood, bursting into tears. "God bless you!" Jack extended his hand towards him and looked anxiously for Thames, but he was nowhere to be seen. A severe pang shot through Jack's heart, and he would have given worlds if he possessed them to have seen his friend once more. The wish was vain, and, endeavoring to banish every earthly thought, he addressed himself deeply and sincerely to prayer. While this was passing, Jonathan had ridden back to Marvel to tell him that all was ready and to give him his last instructions. "You'll lose no time," said the thief-taker. £100 if you do it quickly." "Rely on me," rejoined the executioner, throwing away his pipe, which was just finished. A deep, dread calm, like that which precedes a thunderstorm, now prevailed amongst the assemblage. The 1,000 voices which a few moments before had been so clamorous were now hushed. Not a breath was drawn. The troops had kept a large space clear around the gallows. The galleries adjoining it were crowded with spectators. So was the roof of a large tavern, then the only house standing at the end of the Edgware Road. So were the trees, the walls of Hyde Park, a neighbouring barn, a shed. In short, every available position. The cart, meantime, had approached the fatal tree. The guards, horse and foot, and constables formed a wide circle round it to keep off the mob. It was an awful moment. So awful that every other feeling except deep interest in the scene seemed suspended. At this terrible juncture, Jack maintained his composure. A smile played upon his face before the cap was drawn over it. And the last words he uttered were, "My poor mother! I shall soon join her." The rope was then adjusted, and the cart began to move.
The next instant he was launched into eternity. Scarcely had he been turned off a moment when a man with swarthy features slipped into the cart with an open clasp knife in his hand, and before he could be prevented, severed the rope and cut down the body. It was Blueskin. His assistance came too late. A ball from Wilde's pistol passed through his heart, and a volley of musketry poured from the guards lodged several balls in the yet breathing body of his leader. Blueskin, however, was not unattended. 1,000 eager assistants pressed behind him. Jack's body was caught and passed from hand to hand over 1,000 heads till it was far from the fatal tree. The shouts of indignation, the frightful yells now raised baffled description. A furious attack was made on Jonathan, who, though he defended himself like a lion, was desperately wounded, and would inevitably have perished if he had not been protected by the guards, who were obliged to use both swords and firearms upon the mob in his defense. He was at length rescued from his assailants, rescued to perish 7 months afterwards with every ignominy at the very gibbet to which he'd brought his victim. The body of Jack Sheppard, meanwhile, was borne along by that tremendous host, which rose and fell like the waves of the ocean until it approached the termination of the Edgware Road. At this point, a carriage with servants in sumptuous liveries was stationed. At the open door stood a young man in a rich garb, with a mask on his face, who was encouraging the mob by words and gestures. At length the body was brought towards him. Instantly seizing it, the young man placed it in the carriage, shut the door, and commanded his servants to drive off. The order was promptly obeyed, and the horses proceeded at a furious pace along the Edgware Road. Half an hour afterwards, the body of Jack was carefully examined. It had been cut down before life was extinct, but a ball from one of the soldiers had pierced his heart. Thus died Jack Sheppard. That night a grave was dug in Williston churchyard, next to that in which Mrs. Sheppard had been interred. 2 persons, besides the clergyman and sexton, alone attended the ceremony. They were a young man and an old one, and both appeared deeply affected. The coffin was lowered into the grave, and the mourners departed. A simple wooden monument was placed over the grave, but without any name or date. In after years, some pitying hand supplied the inscription, which ran thus: Jack Sheppard. The end. This ends chapter 32, the closing scene. This ends Jack Sheppard, A Romance by W. Harrison Ainsworth.